So the following debate happened quite a while ago. I think almost like a year ago at this point. And I just wanted to throw in this disclaimer that I no longer believe a lot of the things that I said in this debate. I think specifically I said in this debate that I'm a class reductionist, that I'm an anti-reform left com, all both things which I no longer stand by. And so I just wanted to make that clear because a lot of the positions that you'll hear me taking in this video I don't actually hold currently, um, because this was a while ago and my views have changed since then. But I still think that it was a valuable debate, and I still think there's a value to re-uploading it because in general I think it was a pretty good performance. I put forth a lot of arguments that I think a lot of you might find valuable. I was actually pretty shocked by the response from Stryker's community when he initially uploaded this debate to his YouTube channel, which has since been deleted, which is why I'm re-uploading it. And when he uploaded it, I was expecting the typical this kid's a Jew, whatever, the kind of hand waving away and personal insults. But a large portion of the comments, to my shock, were things like, hey, I agree with Stryker, but a lot of these kids' arguments were very convincing, or, I'm going to have to maybe rethink my position on this issue or that issue, which, those comments kind of made me think, okay, maybe there is value to this. Maybe I can change some people's minds, even on the extremely far right. So that's why I'm re-uploading this. Essentially, I think there is value to this discussion, despite some of my views being kind of cringe. So yeah, that's basically it. I also think, apart from my views, I also think my debating performance or debating skills have evolved since then. I was pretty nervous throughout this debate, so I kind of let myself get talked over a lot. I kind of let myself get gish galloped a little bit. But yeah, apart from all that, I think that this has value to it. So that's pretty much it. I hope you get something out of this.
Live from an Odessa rat line, it's the People's Square. I am your specter, haunting the podcast, Borzoi, here to introduce to you the unstoppable Eric Stryker.
How do you do, everyone? I'm here today with a younger guy. He's apparently a Marxist. You're a left communist, is that correct, Mouthy?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay.
Yep, just a tendency of Marxism.
So just to get that a little clear, so I used to be a Marxist myself. I was a tanky. And from what I remember about left comms is that they're a particularly abstract and purity spiraling type of Marxism that, they won't engage with any real world socialist experiment other than to call it revisionist. And basically it's like a series of tactical nihilism, because it's impossible to argue against a system that only exists in your head. Is that I mean, I know I'm being a little bit of a jerk, but is
Sure.
that...
Well, yeah, that's the criticism that tankies, Marxist-Leninists, Maoists usually levy at left comms. In reality, left comms don't see, well, we are open to admitting that there have been past socialist experiments which have resulted in the establishment of dictatorships of the proletariat, we don't posit that there have been any actually socialist nations in the past, and that the very term socialist nation is a bit of an oxymoron, since Marx defined socialism as an international epoch which abolishes commodity production, which of course is a criteria which has never been met.
So what do you? I mean, that's basically kind of halfway towards Trotskyism, isn't it?
We have some differences from Trotskyism, for example. We differ on the question of national liberation. We differ on the question of using reform as a method of achieving revolution, etc. But Trotskyist and left comms do share a general critique of what we call Stalinism, a emphasis on internationalism, etc.
Okay, so why do you have Lenin in is that like a joke, like the thing with Lenin in your thing?
Well, left comms do like Lenin, depending on the sort of left comms. So, for example, there's like German, Dutch left comms who tend to not like Lenin as much and favor Rosa Luxemburg. Italian left comms, which is the current of left communism, which I subscribe to the most, does take a lot after Lenin. We do have our critiques of Lenin. For example, we think that he was wrong when it came to the question of national liberation. But in general, his ideas regarding the vanguard party and centralism, etc., were very well thought out, and we use these theories put forth by Lenin as core aspects of our ideology, basically.
So on paper, like again, it's very difficult to argue against a system that you're basically one of those guys that said real communism's never been tried. Is that it?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Hold on a second. Let me just X out of something here because I'm getting text messages. Anyway, yeah. So I mean, do you see why people think that's a little immature? I mean, it's very easy to be hypercritical about people that take a step forward in any system. You know, personally, I'm a third positionist, and I oppose capitalism and communism equally. I oppose the common thread between them, which is a materialistic understanding of history and men that also denies science, which is kind of, you know, like the science of race, the science of gender. Capitalism and communism seem to have that in common. You see right now, Gillette just came out. The big corporation that owns Gillette is Procter and Gamble. They just had an $8 billion loss after their transgender shaving ad. So what I would say is, like, you know, Procter and Gamble would never be willing to spend $8 billion to give their employees a paid vacation or health care. But they're willing to waste that money promoting transgenderism and miscegenation and feminism, all these social trends that are very unpopular, as seen by the reaction to this advertising that they did, the program they did. So, you know, if these trends are not simply a form of cultural capitalism that the CEOs and bankers want to engineer our world into, what is it?
Sure. So regarding your first point about how, you know, you claim that left communism is sort of idealistic because it's never, you know, actually been attempted. I can definitely see how people would make that critique, the critique of like, oh, it's idealistic because it's never happened. You know, you critique everywhere that it's actually happened and whatnot. But I think to say that the left com position is invalid because it's never been tried is to have a fundamental misunderstanding of history. So what I like to bring up is the fact that, while yes, we do posit that communism has never worked, and every attempt at communism so far has resulted in failure in initial implementation, what I like to point out is that if you look at it historically, when feudalism emerged out of slave society, as well as when capitalism emerged out of feudal society, there were several examples of both of these systems, or attempts at both of these systems, which failed in initial implementation before they became the prevailing mode of production. So it is a common trend throughout history that when a mode of production is emerging out of another, there are several failures in initial implementation implementation before it becomes the prevailing system. And I don't think that, I think if failure in initial implementation was indicative of an unworkability of the system, we wouldn't be living under capitalism right now. But of course we are. So I don't think that that's a valid critique of the left composition that we often hear, mostly from Marxist-Leninists, Maoists, etc. As far as the assertion, the example you gave of Gillette, and how transgender movement and so on is an example of cultural capitalism. I kind of reject that that premise. So for one thing, while Gillette did lose in the immediate a lot of money, from that ad, I don't think you're looking at the net effect. And I think if you look at the net effect, the benefits that they got from doing that, from they probably encouraged many social advocacy groups to support them, and many socially liberal people to buy from them, etc. I think that you'll find that they did probably make a larger profit off of this the net effect.
There's two things going on there. One, the profit. I see what you're saying. I actually don't entirely disagree that that those ads are virtue signaling, not to increase their customer base, but rather to curry favor with the corporate media, right? Like the media, it gives you free publicity because you'll get the Huffington Post praising you, you'll get CNN promoting you, and so on for free.
Exactly.
For free.
Yeah.
But then at the same time, you're admitting to me that the transgenderism, the feminism, the gay stuff is a form. It's essentially liberalism, isn't it? I mean, that's what you said.
So there can be common goals which are shared by liberals and by Marxists for different reasons, and that we pursue through different methods. So the way I like to frame the whole transgender movement is that, I think a lot of people, such as yourself, alt-right type, fascist type people, will look at the transgender movement, which has been heavily commodified, which has been largely appropriated by large corporations, and say, well, look, this is a movement which is being orchestrated by these corporations. But I don't think that's the correct way to frame it. I think in reality, this movement, the oppression of transgender people, the oppression of gay people, etc., these are things which came about because of class contradiction. The oppression of these people was breeded by the superstructure of capitalist society and the institutions that it formed acting in their own interest. And I think eventually, whenever you oppress a certain group of people, they're going to fight back. And I think what we see is that the transgender people, the gay people, etc., who have been oppressed are now, saying, well, this is not right. We're going to fight back. And the corporate, these corporations and the capitalists and the neoliberals are attempting to appropriate a movement which emerged out of class contradiction and change the goals of this movement to fit within the framework of capitalist society. So I don't think these are movements which are orchestrated by capitalists. I think these are movements which were caused by capitalism, which capitalists are now trying to appropriate to preserve their own dominance.
Okay, so here's a couple of things. So first of all, you kind of said that capitalists or social let's call them liberals, right? Classical liberals, people with money that support social liberalism and individualism. You said that part of the political spectrum can agree with Marxists. They just have different ways of getting towards that end, which is why I say capitalism and communism are the same thing. I would agree with that, actually.
Well, what I mean by that is not that like capitalists and communists even have. I think that the better way for me to have said that is that Marxists and liberals often share similar critiques, but I think the difference is Marxists are actually able to properly analyze the root of the problems which we are critiquing, whereas liberals often see these issues such as transgender oppression in the light that the capitalists want to see them in, which is these are individual issues which are completely random and can be put out individually, whereas Marxists see these as systemic problems breeded by the contradictions of class society. And we see the only way to properly address these issues as the the abolition of class society and the abolition of capitalism.
So your actual argument is that capitalists and liberals are afraid of trannies, and that's why they make trannies their CEO and pass laws in places like New York State, where they want to pass a law where Medicaid, which is the working class or poor people's health care, Medicaid ends up paying for tranny surgeries and hormone treatments. And you're saying that this enabling by the plutocrats and the government of this, paraphiliac or, odd antisocial proclivity is actually because they're afraid of 200,000 trannies in a population of 340 million. I mean, come on. Do you really believe that? They're afraid of them?
No. Not my problem. My argument isn't that they're afraid of transgender people or whatever. My argument is that they're attempting to appropriate social movements which could be used. Okay. So let me give a good example. So what I like to frame like shooting for equality within the framework of the capitalist system as is a sort of social reform. And capitalists have utilized reform, economic reform, and social reform for years to ward off revolutions. And a good example of this would be the U.S. when the New Deal was passed. So there were massive communist parties in the U.S. and FDR was afraid of a revolution happening. So what he said was he wrote a letter to his brother later on in his life saying explicitly that he only passed the New Deal because he was afraid of revolution happening and he wanted to sort of pay off the workers so they wouldn't do revolution. And so what I think that's an example of is him sort of giving like reforms to workers to sort of ward off issues which could be utilized in a revolutionary way, right? Like, so poorness, the crippling poverty many people were facing, the joblessness, this could have been utilized for revolutionary aims, right? Because these are issues which, under proper analysis, we find out came about through class contradiction and so on. And I think that the transgender movement is similar. So these are issues, the oppression of trans people, etc., which emerged from class society and which, with proper theoretical development, could be utilized and recognized by the people as a product of class contradiction and used by revolutionary parties and so on to attain revolution. And in order to keep that from happening, the capitalists, are trying to appropriate this movement and try to change the aims of the movement to rainbow capitalism rather than actual queer liberation, which would be communism.
Right, but in a sense, though, it's not a popular movement. Like, why would your example of FDR and the New Deal is correct in that FDR was trying to stave off a revolution, but that's because the United States had a 30% unemployment rate and people were literally going hungry in a nation that has all the food, that you need. That's very different from, the son of Cher and Bono going out there or Caitlyn Jenner going out there and spending $30,000 to LARP as a woman. That person is not someone who is a threat to the capitalist system. Again, transgenders are a very small percentage of the population. If you put all people that identify as queer and are militant about it in a category, you're not going to get more than 5% of the population. So this is clearly a minoritarian, marginal movement that is no threat, and no one would even talk about it were it not for the fact that Gillette is essentially promoting free propaganda in favor of these, sexual deviants. You want to talk about the contradictions of capitalism. Without capitalism, there would be no gay, quote, gay liberation movement. That is a product of the market and market liberalism. If you look at actual socialist experiments, like take, for example, East Germany or Cuba, right? The state controls housing there, and they allocate housing for families, married couples are prioritized in housing in socialist countries. And in the Third Reich, it was very similar, where married couples that had children, they would get a very low interest loan, and then after 4 children, the loan would be paid off. So that's what the dynamic looks like in socialist countries. In capitalist countries, on the other hand, the people that want to live the homosexual lifestyle, they actually have an advantage in the real estate market, in the private real estate market, because they don't have to pay for children. They don't have the costs of having a family, so they can afford to pay more for housing. So you have a situation where you have families of 4 living in trailers, families in West Virginia of 4 living in trailers, while affluent queers live in some of the most expensive real estate in the country, in San Francisco, Castro District, New York City, and Chelsea. They have these penthouses or big apartments in the center of the cities. So how would the homosexual lifestyle truly grow or be vibrant or even exist without capitalism and market economics that are not based according to need? Because if we had a housing system that was according to need, families would be prioritized, not queers that want to go party in the city. Wouldn't that be how it would work if we had a social society based on need rather than capitalism?
Well, no, I don't think so. So first of all, to address your first point that this is only a marginal issue, and it's unrealistic that the capitalists would feel the need to appropriate this issue and subvert it. I don't agree. So I think that the trans movement can't be taken out of the context of the LGBT movement as a whole. And while polls have shown that polls have historically shown that LGBT people make up a very small percentage of the population. Historically, they've shown that. However, the problem is a lot of these questions have been posed in a way which makes people not comfortable to come out and actually say that they're gay if they really are. They haven't been granted anonymity a lot. In a more recent poll from the National Economic Policy Institute, which used anonymity, which used more subtle questions, found that about 20% of the population has been found to have attraction, or has claimed to have attraction to their own gender.
That's based on a flawed Kinsey. That's based on a very flawed Kinsey study. That is, we could go back and forth on that, but if you think 1 in 5 people are queer, then
no, not necessarily queer, but have attraction to their own gender, which is not really the same thing.
Well, it's homosexual. If you're attracted to your own gender, it's homosexuality.
Well, not necessarily. I mean, you can be like bisexual and be attracted to your own gender. You can be.
It's all in the realm, though.
Sure. I mean, yeah. I mean, it's all on a spectrum, right? At least in my opinion.
Well, that's the Kinsey model. Kinsey. So just for clarification for the audience, Kinsey got those statistics because he studied almost exclusively criminals and prostitutes. And those people, because they're deviant and antisocial, tend to be, for example, many of the most famous serial killers had homosexual tendencies because it's a form of paraphilia. It's a form of in the case of transgender, that's a separate issue. You're right. That's just, it's been very closely linked or co-occurrent with autism. Actual like clinical Asperger's, but that's a different issue. When it comes to homosexuality, you kind of get this realm and world by having people that are in the underworld, and they tend to be victims of molestation or abuse, or they have substance abuse problems. So Kinsey's study is flawed because of that. He didn't take surveys of normal people. He took surveys of criminals, of prostitutes and drug addicts and so on. Would you at least address that? What do you think of that?
Sure. Well, So I don't know if that necessarily, like, I don't know if you can necessarily say that that like contorts the data. I mean, I think that the Kinsey model generally is one that sort of makes sense even for the average person. If you look at it, I mean, it's just like a 4-point scale, right? I mean, of attraction to same sex or opposite sex gender. And I don't know that I mean, you can say that it was based on flawed methods, but if you can't provide me an actual academic critique which lays out how that actually negatively impacts the data and makes it inapplicable to the average person, I mean, that doesn't really mean much, right?
So do people that are career criminals, are they more likely to use drugs than the average person in the population or not? That's one example.
Yeah, sure.
Okay,
I mean,
so
I assume so.
that would be kind of what I'm saying here, is that people that have criminal tendencies, like for example, one of the most common forms of rape in America is not men on women, but actually men on men in prison. Would you accept that's a form of a common form of rape?
Yeah, I'd say so, probably just because of the isolation and sexual repression of men in prison, since they don't really have another way to release their sexual impulses.
Well, the problem is, I disagree with that, because the problem is that in places that have lower violent crime rates, you don't see that. Like, you don't see man on man rape in a Welsh prison like you do in the United States.
Well,
In the United States, go ahead.
I mean, can you like provide me numbers on that? Like, I'm not sure about that, like about the disparities and gay rape in different prisons and in different parts of the world.
Okay. Well, part of it is that the prison population in America is more disproportionately black, and that's why there's a higher proclivity of violent homosexual activity. But furthermore, I would argue that the sickness of American culture of individual liberalism is part of it, and this whole, I mean, that would be like the Soviet socialist critique of America during the 1960s and 70s, when they were pushing the gay stuff really hard. The Soviets said that it was a form of bourgeois narcissism and sociopathic even. And so, the problem with sociopaths, which, would you at least agree that people that are career criminals tend towards being sociopathic more than the average person?
Probably more than the average person, because sociopathic activities are generally crimes. Sure.
Right. So, I mean, is it any surprise that 1 in 5 people in Kinsey's study, when taken from that pool, would have stronger homosexual tendencies? I mean, I've yet to see an actual study from normal people in the general population that says 1 in 5 men have homosexual tendencies. That is unfounded. That you are going entirely on that Kinsey study.
Oh, sure. Well, no, I mean, the study utilized the Kinsey model, meaning, the 1 to 5 model of how the 1 to 5 model of how how homosexual you are on a scale of 1 to 5 is like, very attracted to the same sex to not at all, etc. The study I'm referencing, though, is conducted by Kaufman and Erickson, and was published by the yeah, go ahead.
Oy vey. No, I'm sorry. I busted balls. Go ahead.
Sure. It was conducted by the National Bureau of Economic Research, and it found that about 20% of people reported having same-sex attraction to some degree. Obviously, I'm not going to say that 1 in 5 people are completely gay, but this is very loose. It's just like anybody who has attraction to the same sex. Also, I wanted to address something that you said about how under socialism we would prioritize families, and in capitalism we don't, and so capitalism really gives rise to, or allows queer people to exist more so. I would disagree with that on a couple bases. So first of all, you point to nations like Cuba as examples where housing was allocated by family and so on. But I don't think that these were, socialist nations, right? They still had generalized commodity production. It wasn't international. They hadn't abolished the superstructure, et cetera.
Right, but hold on a second. Let me just say one thing. Would you say that Cuba is closer to socialism than America?
I don't think that you can have a little socialism or a lot of socialism. I think you can have socialism or not socialism. I think socialism is a separate mode of production.
Okay, so you don't think that the fact that one system is collectivist with a planned economy centered around providing based on need is the same? You're saying that's the same thing or similar to America, where it's a plutocracy owned by private corporations and the individual is king. Individuals are prioritized over families. You don't think that's relevant?
Well,
It's
I
a
mean,
difference, isn't it?
there's definitely a difference. I just don't think that that means it's socialist. I think that, Marx said that generalized commodity production is the highest stage of capitalism. And I mean, Cuba certainly still had generalized commodity production, right? Which is like, that's the basis of capitalism. It had production for exchange value. But, yeah, but I would
But
say that,
one thing the chat
okay.
brought up is that you're saying that homosexuality is a spectrum, but socialism isn't. There are countries that are more socialist than others.
Well, yeah, but I mean, sexuality and like psychology isn't the same as like modes of production, Like, I mean, like they're completely different things. I don't think that's really a valid comparison.
Well, I think that if you're going to the bathhouse sucking strangers off, that is homosexuality versus like whatever Kinsey's model asserts, right? That he claims that some people had a homosexual fantasy or dream once or something, that some people in his criminal and prostitute and also another problem with Kinsey's study is that homosexuals were far overrepresented. This is actually, you can look this up actually. I'll send you the links later if you want. People have criticized that the people that Kinsey studied were far more disproportionately homosexual than others. One other thing before we move on about Kinsey is the science of Kinsey is truly poisoned. Did you know that during the Kinsey clinical trials, where they were testing how long it took to orgasm and things like that, did you know that they actually force masturbated an infant to time how long it would take for the infant to quote orgasm? I mean, what do you think of that? Do you think that's appropriate or ethical?
No, of course not. I mean, I'm not in favor of masturbating infants, obviously, but I don't think that.
Kinsey was.
Yeah, sure. But I'm not, again, I didn't just cite the Kinsey study. I cited a study by the National Bureau of Economic Research, which uses, a Kinsey model. And also, I don't know that Kinsey having some unethical approaches necessarily skews his methodology in a way which prevents us from making generalized conclusion based on that study, right? Like ethics violations are not the same as methodological flaws. And I think that that's something that we have to realize.
Okay. All right, so I'm not going to bother arguing with you about socialist experiments because again, I can't argue against a system that only exists in your mind. Like it's never existed. It probably will never exist. What I can argue though is that a lot of your political views. So a lot of people are tired of talking about the gay and transgender stuff because it's just no offense, but it's kind of ridiculous on its face. But what I would like to talk to you about, since you kind of briefly mentioned this before, is the issue of immigration, right? So I'm assuming you're for totally open borders, free movement of people, right?
Yeah. I mean, that's the ideal under communism. I mean, sure.
What about under capitalism?
I don't have any stake in how things should be under capitalism. I don't know.
So you're not pro-immigration now in America.
I'm not pro. I don't, again, like I'm not pro-immigration. I'm not pro-Medicare. I'm not pro-minimum wage. I'm not anti-minimum wage. I'm not anti-immigration. I'm not anti-Medicare. I don't take stands. I don't advocate for reform within the capitalist framework because I think that reform historically only perpetuates the existence of capitalism.
Well, then how do you expect people? I mean, you're not taking any stances on anything at all. How are people supposed to debate you? I mean, this is the problem with left comms. It's like what Lenin said. It's an infantile disorder. When Lenin was trying to negotiate the Soviet Union out of the First World War, left comms like yourself were purity spiraling, saying, "How dare you negotiate with imperialists?" I mean, it doesn't work like that in the real world. In the real world, you oftentimes have to choose between bad and less bad. That's how the real world works. I mean, you can even apply that to your life. Like, how do you get like how do you live in your day-to-day life? Like, how do you make decisions for yourself? If you think that there's nothing but perfect or imperfect and there's nothing in the middle.
I know. I don't think that. I think you're making a false conflation, right? I don't think that there's only perfect and imperfect and there's nothing in the middle. I think that I think that when it comes to capitalism, like specifically, I don't even use the word perfect, right? I just use there's communism or there's not communism. There's ways to achieve communism, and there's other ways which aren't productive in the goal of achieving communism, right? So I'm not saying that we shouldn't do anything that's not completely abolishing communism. What I'm saying is if we are going to take steps towards achieving communism, we shouldn't do it through capitulating to the bourgeois state, capitulating to the capitalist system, and therefore perpetuating its existence. I mean,
Well, what do you
went
think?
over how the FDR bill just was a means to stave off revolution, right?
Well,
I mean, that's what reform is.
Do you think that importing 5 million Mexicans illegally into the United States, do you think that is it makes labor stronger or weaker? Organized labor.
Sure. Well, what do you mean by stronger, weaker? I mean, I think it drives wages down, if that's what you mean.
Okay, so it drives wages down. It also reduces solidarity amongst workers. That's something that even Marx himself would have argued.
What do you mean?
Well, Marx, during the mass migration of Irishmen to London, wrote in letters to Engels that this was actually causing a bit of it was retarding the labor movement in the United Kingdom because it was causing the capitalists would turn the Englishmen and the Irishmen against one another based on largely irreconcilable ethnic or cultural differences.
Sure.
And in America, you see something similar going on. I mean, places like California and New York that have the most immigrants per capita also have the largest wealth disparity between rich and poor. So, if your goal as a left communist is to create conditions for a powerful labor movement, possibly a socialist revolution, surely supporting immigration sets it back, doesn't it?
Well, no, actually, I don't think so. So for one, I'd like to point out that left comms don't agree with, and I don't think any Marxists don't agree with everything that Marx said. I mean, I think if someone were to call themselves a Marxist and agree with every single thing Marx has ever said, they wouldn't really be a Marxist, because Marx always emphasized the need to adapt our ideas based on new information, new material conditions, etc. As far as the immigration, as far as ethnic conflicts among workers, I don't think that these ethnic conflicts are irreconcilable, and I think that there's significant evidence to suggest that there is no inherent relationship between increased ethnic or racial diversity and decreased social cohesion. I think that a core aspect of achieving revolution, according to left comms, is internationalism. It's, the last words of the Communist Manifesto, if you want to go by what Marx said, was "Workers of the world unite." So the idea is we can't have a revolution if we build socialism in one country and export it outwards for a variety of reasons. But we can only achieve socialism if we have a spontaneous international revolution in which the workers of the world unite into a centralized party to rebel against the international bourgeoisie. But again, you said like there's like inherent conflicts between different races. I don't believe that. I don't believe that there are, and I don't think there's an inherent relationship between diversity and decreased social cohesion.
You don't. So you're just going to write off bowling alone and all the various studies that show that people that live in ethnically or racially diverse areas are less charitable, less involved in civic life, less likely to volunteer, and actually less likely to engage in productive or powerful or effective radical activity. You don't think that there's anything to that?
No, I don't think there's anything to that. I mean, the research I've done suggests that there is no such relationship. I mean,
you've done
well, right? Yeah,
what research have you done?
Well, for example,
alone.
Well, for example, Lipford and Yandel 2009 find that a 10% increase in diversity raises volunteerism by 1 per 100 people.
Really?
Alicina and Ferrara 2002 looked at the relationship between racial diversity, ethnic diversity, and income inequality with trust. Income inequality and racial diversity each correlated weakly with 0.1 with trust, while ethnic diversity correlated even more weakly at negative 0.03. I mean, even like the studies which people like you who are trying to make the point that you're trying to make cite, for example, Putnam 2007 found that going from an area with zero diversity to an area with maximum diversity would be predicted to lower trust by 0.14 points on a 4-point scale. The effect of socioeconomic status was much greater, suggesting that even in the studies which you people like to cite, high SES immigrants would increase social cohesion.
SES as in social economic.
Yeah, social. Yeah.
Really? So,
Yeah.
I mean,
even Sean
anecdotally, historically, this is unfounded. You can see that in places like whether you want to talk about the conflicts between Poland and Germany, you want to talk about racial strife in the United States between blacks and whites. I mean, blacks and whites have been living together since the 17th century in America. And there was no real integration. And even in countries that, people like yourself might, I'm not saying you maybe specifically, countries like Brazil that are touted as models for racial integration. Brazil has never had a black or even to my knowledge, a mixed race president. America had a mixed race president before Brazil, where whites are a minority. So clearly there is a lot of, there's a lot going on there for sure. And I'm not saying that it's impossible for people to have friends of different races, but the intimacy and cohesion, the traditions. I mean, think of it this way. For example, let's say we're at a college, right, in an academic environment, and say that the traditional Western way of deducing information, logic, comes from the Greeks, right? Socrates, Aristotle, and so on. These are the conceptualizations of the world, how the prism and glasses we see the world through as Westerners, as white people. Then suddenly you have an influx of people that reject that through colonial studies. So you have right there, just intellectually in a microcosm, you have two sets of people that can't agree on what is even true or not, because one is using the Greek methods and the other wants to deconstruct the Greek methods, and you have no objective way of coming to an agreement. Thus, you have conflict. Do you see how that might work?
Yeah, no, I mean, I know what you mean, and I'm certainly not denying. Like, so I think you moved the goalposts just a little bit in that I never denied that there are no conflicts which are based in race. I never said that you can't find any conflicts based on race throughout history. What I said is that the conflict between races is not implicit, and I think that can be empirically found. Right, while there have been studies which have found conflicts between races, most of these studies have found that the decrease in social cohesion, which results in diversity, though the evidence is mixed that this is even an occurrence. This is caused by people who have been made to feel as though the other is the outgroup or whatever. Like, this is based on like cultural enforced attitudes, not something that's implicit or biological.
But where does culture come from?
I mean, a variety of things. For example, I
is
think
it like what Marxists say, that culture comes from machines and things like that? Come on. Culture comes from people.
I don't think that culture comes from machines. I think that what Marxists argue is that culture is a superstructure which is birthed by the mode of production, which I think is generally true. I mean, if you want like an example, we can look at the nuclear family, which only emerged out of the emergence of the capitalist mode of production, right? Like the nuclear family.
Well, hold on a second there.
Sure.
The de facto state of man before industrialization was agrarian, was it not? Even Marx would admit that. In the West,
depends on the place, sure.
In the West, so think of something. Think of being a subsistence farmer, right? Who has the advantage? The man and woman who have 8 children on a farm, or the party popper, gay orgy having single man who has this whole farm to run for himself. Like, who has the actual advantage there? Do you see how, while you might be right that the traditional family is somewhat engineered by society, there's also a natural obligation to, and it's not just the mode of production and so on, because the family also has more, things that aren't really measured in economic terms. There's affection and love. I mean, one of the biggest reasons why so many women are on antidepressants, this has actually been proven, is that they feel lonely. And they feel lonely because they've dedicated their lives to their career and not to having a family. So the point I'm making here is that in nature, if we were to talk about nature, the family of a man and a woman and children has a massive advantage over the individualist homosexual, doesn't he?
So I think that this is a bit of an ideological mystification. So what I meant when I said that is I meant to go like a little bit far back. So if you look at it back in primitive times, like before the current mode of production, the nuclear family didn't really exist. The community kind of took care of children collectively in many places. People didn't know
Where
whose
exactly?
children was whose.
Where are we talking about? The
Just
West? Or are we talking about Africa?
I'm talking about like just society in general. This was like long before like
Are you talking about
capitalism.
classical Rome?
I'm talking about like
Germania?
hunter-gatherer societies.
Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, and so basically the point is that in these societies, children were kind of taken care of communally. People didn't know whose child was whose, and etc. And so the idea of the nuclear family as it exists today didn't really exist. But with the privatization of the mode of production and so on, came the privatization of the family. With the so like you see how like the family structure and other cultural aspects sort of emerge in accordance with developments in the mode of production. And so I think that's generally the way that Marxists view culture. And I would also like to say that even if I were to take a non-Marxian view, even if I were going to say, well, the mode of production or culture has nothing to do with the mode of production, etc., I still don't think you could extrapolate cultural enforced norms to implicit biases of human nature. And I think that so what I mean is that like if you look at like scientific evidence, or at least according to the research I've done, we can look over some studies if you want. But racism is inherently a learned behavior. It's not implicit. It can be overturned. And so while there is very little impact of of diversity on social cohesion, to the extent that it does exist, it's because of like enforced attitudes which aren't necessarily implicit.
So your model for human progress is, assuming that what you're saying is true, which isn't. I don't agree at all that if we're talking about people in ancient times, that, people were just fucking everyone. Maybe that was true in Africa, but compare African civilizational achievements with European ones. And that's where you see a big gap. However, just to give you the benefit of the doubt on hunter-gatherers, do you think that hunter-gatherer society should be what we look towards for the future?
No, absolutely not. Marxists don't say that communism, when we abolish the current mode of production, we don't say that the family structure will revert back to what it was before communism, just like the mode of production of communism won't revert back to what it was before capitalism. Like, we're not talking about reversion, we're talking about a negation of the negation is what we generally call it. So no, of course the family won't be the same. And my argument was never that the family will go back to what it will be at that time when we move past capitalism. My argument was that the development of capitalism led to the adaptation of the family structure, the change of the family structure, and that once communism emerges, it will too change the family structure. Maybe not necessarily go back to the way it was, but that's not my argument. My argument is just based on how base affects superstructure, essentially.
Okay, so you're saying that. Okay, so let me clarify this. You're saying that because hunter-gatherers didn't have traditional or nuclear families, and no one knew the paternity of the children running around in a community, that that it means that the nuclear family must be abolished or is an oppressive structure of some sorts? Is that what you're saying?
No. I'm not saying that it's an oppressive structure or that I'm not saying it descriptive. I'm not saying it from a normative standpoint. I'm not making a more normative claim that it should be destroyed, and I'm not necessarily saying that it's an oppressive structure. What I'm saying is that it's a product of the mode of production, and that when we look at points when we had different modes of production, the family structure was different. So inevitability in the change of the mode of production, which is what I advocate for, will lead to a change in the family structure.
Okay, because what I'm saying here is that you are right to a point. For example, in sub-Saharan African societies, the nuclear family is non-existent. You're right about that. It doesn't exist traditionally. It was only through an imposition of European colonialism that Africans in sub-Saharan Africa started to think in those terms to a degree. But what I am saying though is that what's the positive position you're taking? Like, if socialism and communism will lead to the abolition of the family, what is that going to look like if not the original, which is no one knows who the father of children is. They're just running around and like they don't have parents and like what is that? So what does it look like, in other words?
Well, I mean, as Marx once said, I think he retorted to somebody when they asked him about specific questions about how communist society would look. He said, if you want to see the future, go to a circus, see a genie or a fortune teller or whatever. I'm not really in the business of saying what it will look like or making I'm not in the business of fortune telling, right? But I think it's a little bit of a black and white fallacy to say that you either have what it was or you have what it is right now. I don't think you can honestly defend the position that there are only two conceivable family structures and it's this one and this one, right? Like, I don't think anybody could honestly defend that position, right? I think
there is a conceivable family structure, which is the mother and the father and the children, and not that, which is what they're trying to do now with gay adoption and polyamory and other sick stuff. Usually that stuff is like associated with really horrible shit.
No, it's not. Gay adoption is not associated with any negative outcomes for children.
So you don't think the fact that, okay, so let me ask you this. If you don't believe in a traditional family structure, would you be comfortable with a single man, a single heterosexual man adopting children?
I think that single parents in general, whether it's a man or not a man, raise children worse than two parents for sure. Okay. But I what I'm talking about is like a gay adoption, right? And I think
well, no, I'm asking you. I'm not asking about that. I'm asking.
Okay. Well, you brought it up.
Specifically, Specifically, what I'm saying: would you trust a heterosexual man, going to an adoption agency and adopting a 14-year-old girl? Would you be cool with that?
So I think what you're implying is that there's a chance that this man is a pedophile.
I didn't say that. You said it.
Well, I mean, yeah, I said it because I'm inferring of what I think you're implying. And I don't think that's unreasonable, right? But I think that there are ways to detect pedophilia based on things like, certain personality traits, which have been which can be quantified as determinants of pedophilia. And I think
homosexuality.
Well, no, homosexuality actually isn't linked to pedophilia.
That's very questionable, friend, because there have been, before the politicization of this realm in terms of the academic study, there are many studies done in the 1970s and 80s that show that there's a very strong link between homosexuality. On the one hand, being sexually abused, something like gays themselves will say this, which is that something like 30 or 40% of homosexual men, self-identified homosexual men, were sexually abused as kids by adult homosexuals. And on top of that, you have situations where, as you were saying, single parents make terrible parents, but that's because the man and woman dynamic isn't there in the household,
So there's a couple things that I think we should parse through here. So on the one hand, we have the link between homosexuality and pedophilia, and
Right.
and I mean, if you want to talk about that, I mean, we can. I don't see any evidence for that. In fact, I see a lot of evidence to the contrary.
I'll
For
definitely
example,
send you. I'll definitely send you some of the studies I was talking about after this.
sure. Yeah. I mean, I've
Yeah.
seen some of these studies. For example, some of the studies that I would like to bring up is a study conducted by a guy named Freund ETL in 1989 showed potentially erotic images of children to homosexual males and heterosexual males and measured the penile volume changes during the presentation of the potentially erotic stimuli in an attempt to determine whether there were any disparities in the arousal of homosexual men experienced when presented with these images as compared to heterosexual men or homosexual men. The study found that homosexual men showed no more sexual arousal towards the images of children compared to homosexuals.
That sounds like a political study by a Jew, which it is.
Well, can you like show me evidence of that? Like,
let me use logical deduction instead, because the thing is, if we're going to get into, like, I'll show you a study and you'll say no, that study is flawed, it's homophobic. Then you'll show me a study by some Jew. You'll show me a study by some Jew, totally politicized, that basically just like the Kinsey stuff, who's not Jewish, but just like the Kinsey stuff and so on, or even Freud, never been clinically proven, and yet we defer to Freud. But the point I'm making is, see, when I suggested,
it's not Freud. Freud.
I didn't say that. I didn't say it was. I know. They're two different people. Freud is long dead by 1989, to my knowledge. But the point I'm making, that you viscerally see, I didn't mention pedophilia when I said there's a single heterosexual man, and he wants to adopt a 15-year-old girl. I said nothing about pedophilia or ebophilia, which is a more accurate term. You just immediately jump to that, right? Now, not every individual. What if it's just a single man who's a particularly loving and kind person that wants to raise the girl as his daughter?
Well, sure.
Hold on a second. So the reason you viscerally made a knee-jerk reaction to that in terms of sexualizing it is because there is an assumption that men in general have an attraction to not children as a whole, but perhaps teenagers, right? There is a link there. That has been proven, that men tend to be attracted to younger women, right? What I'm asking you is, why would that distinction change if the man is a disgusting queer? Why would that distinction change? Would you deny that homosexuals prioritize youth as beauty? Would you reject that? That's simply not. That's unfounded. Anyone familiar with homosexual culture knows one of the big things about gay culture is the romanticization, eroticization of youth, particularly teenage boys. I mean, even with right wingers like Milo, when Milo was in charge of this art exhibit, he made sure to put lots of pictures of very gray area in terms of age boys. Shirtless, naked boys all over the place to prove that the Republicans are pro-gay too. So, would you deny that there's a link between men and being attracted to younger women, including teenage women, and thus also men who are the same?
Well, so the first thing that you said was you said men in general are attracted to teenage women. Why would that change if they're a queer? I mean, being gay is characterized by not being attracted to women. So I don't know how.
I didn't say that. I said men are attracted to youth. I didn't say women exclusively. Men in general are attracted to youth. Are they not?
So you think that nobody should be able to adopt?
No, I'm saying that usually, when they are given, when adoption agencies background check someone, they make sure that it's a man with a woman, because the assumption there is that this is a family man and he's not a creepy pervert, right? I mean, again, you reflexively said, "Oh, you're making this about pedophilia." I never said that. You simply assume that. I mean, you understand that many airlines, for example, if there's a child that's unaccompanied flying and a man sits next to that child, the people that run the airlines will not allow the man under any circumstances. In fact, quite insulting, because the assumption is that all men are child molesters. But the airline, for liability reasons, will not allow a single man to sit next to a child. So what I'm saying is, why should you allow two gay men in a precarious relationship that is, their identity, homosexual identity is entirely revolved around sex? Why would you let two men around that child? Is it better if you put the child on the plane in the middle seat between two gays? Is that less of a liability? That's all I'm asking you.
Well, so I think that you're kind of, I think that you're kind of conflating like single people. So your implication when you said that a single person would, your implication when you say that like we wouldn't let a single person just adopt a kid is that they're not married, so they might
No,
have
a single man, because single women get foster children all the time.
Sure.
So
Sure.
it's specifically discrimination against single men that somehow goes out the window if the two men are sexual deviants. I think it's bizarre. That's all I'm saying.
Because so take a heterosexual couple and take a homosexual couple. What we should base this on is the available scientific evidence. Now, there's no scientific evidence suggesting that gays are disproportionately pedophiles, and there's no scientific evidence suggesting that gay parents adopting raise worse kids just in the aggregate.
That's not true. In fact, there was a study not long ago that featured lesbian couples, which are actually less likely to molest a child because they're two women. And girls raised in a lesbian household were more likely to be sexually abused. But then, forget all that. As a left-com Marxist, why is it that your superstructural understanding of everything seems to end at the academic classroom? Isn't academia and these kinds of studies they do, isn't that part of the superstructure of capitalism? Of course it is, isn't it?
Well, it's the usage of the utilization of the scientific method, with peer-reviewed methodology that I can look at and analyze to see if there's any biases or flawed methodology, et cetera. And also, you talk about how there was a study done which showed that kids tend to be molested more, when they're raised by gay couples. And sure, you can bring up that one study, but if you look at the macro picture, the overwhelming evidence doesn't seem to suggest this. For example, a ginormous meta-analysis from Cornell University of over 70 studies found that on average, kids raised by gay parents adopting are no worse off than the average child. A study by Biblars and Stacy analyzed 10 years of data, almost all of the studies that exist on the subject, and found the same thing. Even if you discount studies which use sample bias and look at only longitudinal, quantitative, random, nationally representative studies, this shows the same thing. And the only aspects
why does the data change according to the zeitgeist? Because 30 years ago, you had people like Anita Bryant, who had a movement called Save the Children. That was an anti-homosexual movement where it was largely understood, where she cited scientific studies saying that homosexuals were far more likely to molest and abuse children. So suddenly the science changes. The same studies come up with different conclusions. Somehow we're expected to believe that, sexual perverts are less likely to be perverts, which is laughable on its face. But the point I was getting at is that the science changes depending on the political interest involved. For example, in our university system, we see, for example, Harvard is a for-profit university. It depends on the money, the millions of dollars from bourgeois grantees and corporations and stuff like that. So, you admitted to me that liberals share a lot of the same social critiques as Marxists, right? Capitalists and Marxists will critique the traditional family. They'll critique the idea of a racially homogenous society and tradition, because for different reasons, but they make similar critiques. So what I'm saying is, does the money of these, elite financiers that essentially provide the grants, these think tanks, liberal think tanks, like the Ford Foundation, that provide the grants for these pro-homosexual studies, do you think that might create a slant or a bias in their methodology? And if not, why is it that they're perfectly objective with the gay stuff, but then when they say other ridiculous stuff like the idea that the unemployment is falling or that workers are better off now than ever before, why is it that when they come up with those conclusions, it's a bourgeois lie, part of the capitalist superstructure, but then with the gay stuff, they're 100% honest and good faith, and it's just pure science? Why? What is that distinction?
Okay, so there's a few things to parse through here. So for one, you talk about how the data and the conclusions drawn by the data change based on the time, right? And I mean, of course, that's going to be true because as time goes by, there's new methodological techniques are developed. We get more efficient ways of collecting information. So of course, conclusions are going to change based on time as it develops. Now, if you're trying to say that it changes because of political ideology, because of bias, I mean, I don't think it's enough to just kind of blindly assert that. I think you have to provide me some flaws in the methodology. I mean, we have peer review for a reason. I mean, the APA, which a lot of like fascists and social conservatives like to point to, is like, oh, look, it's biased. They have released a paper on how their researchers are required to avoid bias in their studies. So like peer review exists. There are papers which outline how to avoid bias. An AAUP survey found that conservative academics finding conservative conclusions in left-wing dominant fields did not feel targeted and were never discouraged to come out with their research. So I don't see any real bias. I mean, you're kind of just asserting things without really any data
So
or
what about
evidence.
that woman at Brown University, I believe, who did a study not long ago on transgenderism, how it's basically just a fad? That person was browbeat to death. Brown University withdrew the study and apologized, didn't explain why, if there were any methodological errors on it. They just withdrew it because the trannies were basically screaming and hollering, and the capitalists were threatening to pull their grants from the school. You don't think that's bias? I mean, of course it is. You're pressured. If you're in a for-profit university, you're pressured to do what is profitable. And what is profitable is telling liberals, the plutocrats, liberals in the places like Google, who frankly agree with all your views on sexuality, to come up with conclusions they find palatable. There's an absolute correlation there, isn't there?
So, first of all, assuming that your story is completely true, which I have trouble believing because
I'll pull it up for you while you talk. Go ahead.
Sure, of course, go ahead. Because typically when people make these assertions, for example, I've heard people tell me, oh, look, this study criticizing gay adoption was largely discredited by the academic community. It's because they're biased. The study was Ragnaros 2012. I read the study; it had serious methodological flaws in that it conflated single parents with gay parents, for example. The same thing happened with Allen 2013. So typically when these studies come out which find like controversial things and they're like discredited in large part, what turns out happening was that they had serious methodological flaws.
Okay,
right?
Well,
and even
over here, Frank, can you pull up the article I put in the chat? Put it on the screen.
Oh shit, there's a mosquito. Oh, okay. Brown
there you go.
Hold on.
There it is. So this study, which essentially saw childhood transgenderism as basically an internet fad, like a fad that is came to be due to peer pressure, cultural influences from capitalists and Jews, and internet spaces like Tumblr. They found that a child that is exposed to these social forces is more likely to identify as transgender. This study was repealed by Brown, not because of its methodological errors, but because the study didn't give the results that were politically correct. I mean, political correctness is that you have an ideology and then you create science to support that ideology, right? And that, I mean, you could say time, as time goes on. Well, in the Soviet Union during the Stalin years, even as the rest of the world accepted Mendelian genetics, Joseph Stalin rejected this science, and instead they were Lamarckians, right?
Sure.
And in the Soviet universities, if you dissented from the Lamarckian consensus, you were fired from the university, if not put in a gulag. In the United States, we see intellectuals and geniuses, really, like Watson, the scientist, the man who discovered the DNA, Watson, who won a prize for it and everything. when he said that the scientific facts showed that, intelligence is linked to race, they took his prize away from him. And he was browbeat. The man is in his 80s, was browbeat out of academia. He was drummed out. His life was made a living hell. He got death threats, and they took his career away from him. And the reason for that is that the status quo, the government, and the big plutocrats that run our government, which I assume you would agree that the capitalists have an influence on engineering the superstructures, as you would say.
Sure.
Well, the superstructures all support your assertions on gay stuff, on racial stuff, on transgender stuff. So you have to tell me where you draw the line. Is it just that you pick and choose on what's convenient? Because even with the Marxist stuff, you were saying, well, Marx is not a dogma. But then the whole left-com thing is that Marx is a dogma, because Marx said that socialism must only occur in this specific circumstance. So then you have a real socialist revolution, a real communist revolution in Russia or China, and you say, no, that's illegitimate because those guys were not doing exactly what Marx says in the Critique of the Gotha program. So, there's a lot of inconsistency in what you believe.
Sure. So a few things to parse through. So first of all, I looked up the study that you talked about and how it was Brownby, and as expected, there was actually large methodological flaws which were found in it by other resources. For example, or by other researchers. For example, Dr. Julia Serrano, a researcher with 2 decades of experience in developmental and evolutionary biology, explored the study and cited far more well-researched history of gender dysphoria and client-supportive transition care. And she writes that what's actually rapid about the theory of the initial paper, ROGD, is parents' sudden awareness and assessment of their children's gender dysphoria, which for a long time has been culturally suppressed. So yeah, this study was like heavily critiqued in its methodology, not its conclusions, by several.
Why was it published? Why was it published and peer reviewed then?
Well, several studies are published and then are later found to have methodological flaws and revoked. I mean, you can find this everywhere. But even if I were to grant you this one example of like, yeah, this happened, I don't think that you can take one anecdote and apply it to a broader social trend.
Well, if you see, think of it objectively. Let's not get into semantics or pedantic stuff here. Let's think of it objectively. If you see a colleague study something on transgenderism, on race, on homosexuality, and they come to a conclusion that the elites in the neoliberal power structure don't like, and then you see that person's career get ruined, isn't that an example for you, if you're a career academic, to not touch those things unless you're going to give them the results they want? I mean, think of it logically.
Well, for one thing, this lady's career wasn't ruined. Her study was largely criticized and then revoked. And
she
another
was personally attacked. She was personally terrorized. And Brown University humiliated her by saying they were sorry for having this academic on their payroll. And if it wasn't, I'm not sure if she's tenured or not, but if it wasn't for that, I mean, we see it with other figures like Kevin McDonald, whose life was devastated because he studied Jewish behavior over centuries, and came to a conclusion that Jews didn't like. So from that day on, he would get students in his class standing up, yelling at him, big pressure from the big Zionist organizations like the SPLC and ADL to get him fired, but he was tenured. Nowadays, as I don't know if you're familiar with the academia now, but nowadays it's almost impossible to have tenure. So it's no coincidence that the people that were coming out with these studies were largely tenured academics 40 years ago when this was a common practice. Now, without tenure, or very rare forms of tenure given out based on political complacency, the people in academia are afraid to lose their job, which is why they won't talk about these things. That's why there have been studies that say that genetic scientists and biologists often will privately support the idea that race is genetic, but publicly will refuse to say it because they are afraid of the social and political consequences for it. You don't think that's relevant? Of course it is. Aren't there political consequences for delving into, I'll use language you're familiar with. There's political and social consequences for supporting or putting out a study that gives credence to scientific racism or scientific homophobia, isn't there?
Of course there is. I mean, there's scientific.
Well, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah. Well, okay. So, um, a couple things. So for one, it seems to me that I haven't seen, any evidence. Maybe this did happen, but I haven't seen any evidence that this woman who released this paper, was physically attacked. I mean, maybe she was, but I'm not sure. I haven't seen any evidence of that. She
I
was.
never said that. I never said she was physically attacked.
Oh, I thought you did. Okay.
I
Well, so
said she was humiliated and
yeah, by
probably
her.
by the chair of her department.
Well, she
Uh,
was humiliated by them like revoking the study and saying, we're sorry for publishing this. But again, I think you're making the false assumption that this is because it came to a certain conclusion, but rather the proper analysis is that it was heavily denied by several academics. Several academics released their own papers critiquing it and explaining how the methodology was flawed. So, yeah, I mean, if a researcher is going to release something with very flawed methodology that's not sound research, then yeah, they rightfully should be embarrassed by that. And
Well,
they're
there are several there are
discredited by the
several
organization.
there are several academics that argue that black crime in inner cities is a product of a lack of vegetables in the inner city, or there's all types of academics that argue all types of nonsense, and
Yeah,
those studies are never those the studies. Will you at least grant that the studies that support the elite consensus on these issues rarely, if ever, are retracted? I mean, we can look at some of the big pro-immigration studies. Earlier you admitted that mass immigration it lowers wages under capitalism, which is true. You
well,
admit that. Well, hold
but
on.
you
You admitted
said
that.
that. Go ahead.
You admitted that.
Yeah.
Well, the vast majority of academic research on this says the opposite. Their claim, the Cato Institute, many universities, their claim is that unlimited immigration, mass immigration, actually raises wages and it makes countries wealthier.
Yes, and
So
other organizations such as the Fraser Institute have largely critiqued these studies, and they haven't really faced a lot of backlash. I mean, their organization is still very much there and thriving. So I think this example actually
are you kidding
points to
me?
my
Numbers,
conclusion.
the big anti-immigration think tanks that critique these studies, like Numbers USA, like the what is it? What's the other one? Shit. Well, a bunch of them. Those are on SPLC hate group lists.
So you're
And
taking
and
like
when
the
people
SP, you're saying like some random organization saying that you're hateful for what you believe is like indicative of like a broader like social attitude and like discrimination
No,
towards certain
no.
beliefs.
What I'm saying is that elite Jewish organizations like the Southern Poverty Law Center, if you put out, the Center for Immigration Studies, if you're the Center of Immigration Studies, if you're Numbers USA, and you do an academic critique of the falsehoods that immigration actually raises wages, they will put you on a list. And what does that mean? When you get put on the list, you can't get donations through the Amazon charity program. So the pro-immigration think tanks can get donations, but not you. You're at a disadvantage. You get deplatformed from various payment services. You get attacked. You get anarchists attacking your facility. I mean, the American Psychological Association, you know the story of why they took homosexuality off their list of mental illnesses. It was
Actually,
because, yep.
it was because like 5,000 psychiatrists voted too.
No, it was actually because
Well, that's why it was taken off the DSM.
no, it was because homosexuals protested and stormed the APA offices and intimidated them into doing that.
Well, no, there was a vote of psychiatrists, and over 5,000 voted to take it off the DSM, and like 3,000 voted to keep it there, and so they decided to take it out of the DSM. I mean, that's like that. Like, if you want to like look it up, I mean, that's like the actual reason that they took it off is because of a scientific consensus, not because of some like bullying or whatever.
What was the big study that brought this quote scientific consensus where suddenly we go from 1,000 years of seeing homosexuality as at the very least deviant and antisocial to suddenly saying it's the ideal citizen? Like, I mean, that was social pressure, not scientific pressure.
Well,
and the social pressure came from organized. I mean, this would actually work with your worldview, in that it was gay radicals, gay activists that pressured the APA, especially with support of various money people like Paul Singer. they're able to pressure people, and if someone puts a gun to your head, just like the Lamarckians in the Soviet Union denying the science of genetics of Mendel, if someone puts a gun to your head, you're going to say whatever the fuck they want. So
Sure.
yeah.
So I mean the actual, I mean, you ask like what were the studies which led to them taking it off
Sure.
of the DSM. I mean, there actually were quite a few studies. I mean, if you want to look back to like the 50s, I mean, Hooker in 1957, after controlling for IQ, education, and age in heterosexual and homosexual men, health experts unaware of each man's sexual orientation did not find any significant differences in psychological adjustment ratings of homosexual and heterosexual men, finding that homosexuality is not intrinsically linked to any sort of psychopathology and therefore isn't a
right. But that's
I mean,
well, hold on a second. That was a study done in the 1950s where homosexuality was very much policed by the public. Like, homosexuals were not able to practice homosexuality. In fact, many homosexuals in the 1950s got married and lived normal lives. Like, I'm not saying that homosexuals are by nature, mentally ill. What I am saying is that a lot of them are just, they have traumas, or they're, they have some issue or something. Just like a person that has tendency to schizophrenia. If he's put in the correct material conditions, his schizophrenia may not manifest itself. And so in the case of homosexuals in the 1950s, it was very difficult for homosexuals to get together and form their own communities and give each other AIDS and do meth together and fucking do, have orgies and things like that. That's a very modern innovation. So in other words, if homosexuals have a tendency towards paraphilia, which is an accepted or always was an accepted scientific term for someone who becomes a little deviant, it turns into a slippery slope, which is why a lot of people, the gay movement promised that gay marriage was the last stop, and now 10 years later we're seeing child transgenders doing strip tease at gay pride parades for money, right? So
sure. So
paraphilia is real.
So I think you kind of proved my point, because you said that homosexuality may not be intrinsically linked to any mental disorder, but rather whether or not homosexuals have mental disorders is dependent on their environment and the kinds of conditions that they are subjected to. By DSM-5 criteria, this doesn't meet the your definition of homosexuality and its relationship to mental illness. By your own criteria, or by what you said, homosexuality does not meet DSM-5 criteria for a mental disorder. So I don't know how you can say like, well,
no, that's not exactly what I said. What I said was that people with homosexual tendencies, if those tendencies are socially repressed, will turn out very differently than people whose homosexuality is normalized. If tomorrow we normalized rape, a lot more people would be committing acts of rape, right? Would that make it normal? No. It was just this normalization of a bad behavior. But because in the 1950s, men were expected to get married, and if they had homosexual tendencies, to suppress these, the various issues associated co-occurrent with homosexuality were reduced compared to now.
So you think that the negative externalities of being homosexuality are reduced by stigma? Because like all of the empirical evidence tends in like the opposite direction. Like if you look at suicide rates of mental illness, rates of STDs, all of these things are positively correlated with stigma. I mean, I can give you an example. I mean, what was the study? Meyer 2001 and Mason Cochran 2003 found that the extent to which a homosexual is stigmatized positively associates with their likelihood of being suicidal, having a mental illness. Similar studies have found the same thing, that stigma increases the likelihood of a homosexual having STDs, etc.
What the problem with that is, the problem with that is that if a schizophrenic commits suicide, is it because schizophrenia is stigmatized, or is it because the mental illness manifests itself in a way that causes stigmatization? I mean, if a gay person in the 1950s gets married and has children, he's not going to commit suicide because he has a loving family. He has a strong set of social bonds. I mean, there are far more things. So, there's a lot of increasingly with heterosexuals, there's a big problem with, not as big as in the homosexual community, but amongst, white people in kind of isolated places, they tend towards suicide and towards drug abuse, just like homosexuals, just at a lower rate. And the reason for that is because these are diseases of sadness, right? And the gay lifestyle is stigmatized because it's a world full of disease. It's a world full of sociopaths. It's a world full of narcissism. It's a world full of drugs. You can't compare. I mean, it's not a unique evil to homosexuals. I mean, if women were just as horny as men would probably be going around fucking all the time, and families wouldn't be formed, and STDs would blow up. But when you take that balance of man and woman out of the equation and you just have men, I mean, it's a free for all. That's why, there's glory holes for gays, but very few times are you going to see a woman in a glory hole, right? Because of the promiscuity itself is what causes some of the despair, the intense promiscuity.
Well, I mean, if you want to talk about promiscuity, I mean, we can. And there's actually significant evidence that this promiscuity is actually exacerbated by stigma, which is what I was talking about. So I think in bringing up promiscuity, you kind of validate my point. For example, Meyer and Frost in 2009 found that internalized homophobia, which is a direct result of stigma, is directly correlated with worse relationship status among homosexuals. Moreover, it's pretty well known that for many years, gay people have been barred from one of the key institutions which places heavy disincentives on promiscuity and infidelity, that being marriage. And when gays have been allowed to get married, we've seen their rates of promiscuity and so on actually going down. And this is according to a study published by Family Process. So no, I think that if you want to look at like promiscuity,
how many gays actually get married compared to heterosexuals? I mean, I can look it up, and the rate is far lower.
It's far lower because they've just been allowed to get married, right? And so cultures take a long time to adapt. If a certain group of people have not been allowed to get married for a very long time, once they suddenly are allowed to, they're not just going to start doing it immediately, because for years their culture has adapted to not getting married, right? And
when you look at the superstructure of these things, homosexuals tend to live in the main choke points of power in San Francisco, in New York, and they tend to be overrepresented amongst the capitalist class. They tend to be overrepresented in media, and they tend to be heavily overrepresented in advertising and so on. That's where you get this crap like the Gillette commercial about transgender. So homosexuals are, second to Jews, are basically, they have the reins of culture. Gays dominate the movie industry. They dominate art. All the superstructures of capitalism are heavily overrepresented with homosexuals. The man that is overseeing the wealthiest company in the history of humanity, which is Apple, is a homosexual. So what stigma is there, if anything? What they're doing, the reason heterosexuals are suffering is because queers are in charge and they do nothing but stigmatize the traditional family. Because it's not about leaving everyone alone. It's about, I want to go into your Christian bakery and make you bake a gay cake. I want to go into the bikini wax salon and make them wax my balls. Like, that's something that can only be a product of homosexuals and the billions of dollars that go into gay causes, like the Human Rights Commission, which is financed entirely by big plutocrats from Wall Street. So the gays have very elite fans. Now, I will say this. One thing you might be right about is that, yes, working class and to a lesser extent lower middle class people do stigmatize homosexuals because it's just viscerally repulsive, and they also see they see that their families are under threat because the affluent gays are preying on them. They're forcing through curriculums in their schools that normalize homosexuality. They're forcing through in the media. If you were around during Pride Month, you saw nothing. You were saying gays are stigmatized, but then how do you square that with rainbow capitalism? where every major corporation forces you to consume homosexual advertising. I don't have a choice to go on Twitter and see two men making out. I can't tune that out, right?
Well, for one, doesn't the indication that these companies are increasingly pushing for homosexuality, doesn't that in itself mean that, if being gay itself, if homosexuality wasn't intrinsically a social issue, wouldn't there be no reason for all of this? And the fact that it's a social issue means that they are stigmatized. And also, when it comes to you talking about how gays are overrepresented and all this stuff, I actually don't see a lot of data indicating that. I mean, for example, a Williams Institute study at the UCLA School of Law examined a meta-analysis and found that gays are actually on average poorer than the average straight person in the general population.
So you're telling me that, well, the problem with that is, how do you, for example, separate elite homosexual? I'm not saying that there aren't gays that take food stamps, right? What I am arguing is that simply by nature of being a homosexual, you're going to be more affluent because you have more disposable income because you don't have children, right? So, I mean, all things equal, gays have an economic advantage in liberal capitalism.
Well, how can you say that? Because actually it's been found that people who are part of nuclear families are more financially stable.
Perhaps the children, but if you're a father, you have mouths to feed. If you're a gay, you don't. You just have yourself. You can spend your disposable income on vacations. You can spend it on luxuries. You can't deny that the wealthiest zip codes in America tend to be disproportionately gay. An apartment in Chelsea, Manhattan, which is the big gay district in New York, goes for $4,000 a month for a one-room apartment. Working class families can't live in that, but it's a big gay district. The ditto for places like the Castro in San Francisco. So the wealthiest zip codes in America tend to be either entirely or disproportionately gay.
Sure. So a couple things. Oh, I just forgot to address something that you said earlier that I was going to address, but that you kept bringing up. So first of all, when it comes to gay people, you can say that they have an economic advantage because of this and this, and you can kind of assume all of these factors and try to logically come up with these factors, but the problem is logic, and just using logic and coming up with these deductions and on a live stream with no research is kind of problematic, because inevitably there's going to be a lot of factors which you can't really take into consideration on the spot, and which are better examined through peer-reviewed studies with peer-checked methodology. And when this is done, again, you find that gays are on average poorer. The people who are part of nuclear families are on average more financially stable. These are just facts.
So are you saying that a Hollywood movie director, what's a gay more likely to be, a Hollywood movie director or a construction worker? Disproportionately.
I'm not really sure how common construction work is, but if you want to
far
talk
more
about
common than being a movie director or an artist.
Well, then I would say that because movie directors and artists are disproportionately very wealthy, and gay people are disproportionately very poor, I think it's more likely that most gay people are average common day workers. I think this is the conclusion most consistent with the evidence.
Would you say the same thing about white people?
That white people are, the average white person in a vacuum is more likely to be a blue collar worker than a movie director? Yeah, I would say that about white people.
Well, not just that, but that because a white person, actually, there is a statistic that said white people are 78% of minimum wage workers, which is actually white people are disproportionately more likely to be a minimum wage worker. The average minimum wage worker in the United States is white and female. Meanwhile, whites are barely 60% of the country. Mm-hmm. So the point I'm making is, so if the fact that gays are heavily overrepresented in corporate boardrooms, heavily overrepresented in the movie industry and other, not just wealth producing or wealth generating fields, but culturally significant. You will admit that being in charge of Apple gives you a lot of power, right? You will admit that.
I mean, yeah, sure.
And you will admit that Apple being on the front lines of pushing cultural liberalism on sexuality, on race, on borders, that this has an impact on society as a $1 trillion company. It will impact how the culture goes, which direction it goes, whether working people like it or not. You will admit that.
I mean, to an extent, but again, I
Okay.
don't buy your premise that gay people are like disproportionately wealthier in positions of powers. Again, the actual data, rather than just inductive reasoning, suggests that gay people are on average poorer.
So you're saying that because there are some homosexuals that get in a lot of debt because they spend all their money on cocaine. I mean, technically, Milo Yiannopoulos
is the aggregate.
Right. So technically, Milo Yiannopoulos is very poor because he's $1 million in debt. But Milo Yiannopoulos is $1 million in debt because he blew all the money the Mercers gave him on blow and Versace clothes. So
yeah, but is talking
he's
about Milo
technically poor.
Yiannopoulos, who's like one person, really like indicative of the attitudes of like a demographic which encompasses like over 1 million people? I mean, come on,
Yes.
you know that a
He's an
sample
archetype.
size of one, you know, that a sample size of one person is not a valid sample size with which to create a objective, descriptive claim, right? Like forming a claim around an examination based on a sample size of one it would not be taken seriously methodologically by like any researcher ever.
So you're saying that luxury is not a big part of the gay subculture? Like, I mean, you have heard that meme, was it intergalactic luxury communism? How's it go? You probably know it.
Fully automated luxury gay space communism, right?
There you go. So even communists who are more of like yourself, like a left com, who's more of the gay, pro tranny, they seem to accept on some level that luxurious living is a big part of the LGBTP, I would say, lifestyle. Okay.
Well,
that luxury and plushness and travel precariousness. Remember, if you're gay, you don't have a family, you don't have to lay down roots, right? So you travel, you can travel around the world, very precarious. Maybe at the end of that, some gays, yes, they are heavily in debt. But you can't deny that some of the wealth that the wealthiest zip codes, like, where do you think there's more gays? In Morgantown, West Virginia, or in the big centers of the cities around the country?
So, I mean, if you're gonna take like aggregate of like big cities or like one state, I mean, there's probably going to be more people in general living in these big cities than just in this one like area. Right? This is like a weird
per capita.
You mean per capita? Oh, well, I mean, no, I wouldn't. I wouldn't say that based on the available evidence, gay people are disproportionately likely to be living luxury lifestyles. I mean, maybe you can say that it's like an archetype in media or like a stereotype that gay people who are wealthy live more luxurious lifestyles because they're more feminine or whatever. Like, this may be a stereotype, but this does not mean that on the aggregate, gay people are more wealthy. This is just not true. This is a completely unfounded claim.
So you don't see one of the big things that even some leftists have studied, that queers are often, they go hand in hand with gentrification of city centers. You don't agree with that?
What do you mean?
Well, when the center of a city, homosexuals, because they're more likely to live to be kind of in that artistic world, they tend to they tend to flock to these. They tend to be gentrifiers, in other words.
Okay, I don't think that means that they're on average more wealthy.
You don't think that being a gentrifier makes you more wealthy than the people you're gentrifying out? I do.
Well, I mean, yeah, but that has nothing to do with aggregate, right? Like, you can say that some gay people, in a theoretical example, will be more wealthy than some black people in the same theoretical scenario, but this doesn't mean that on the aggregate, gay people are on average more wealthy than the average, the general population, or whatever you want to say, because this again is just empirically not true. It's just empirically unfounded. Like gay
Okay,
people
so
on average have lower socioeconomic status, are poor. Like this is just like objective consensus.
no, well, it sounds kind of it sounds, you know what that sounds like? It sounds like a Marxist retcon for abandoning the working class for these fads, boutique liberal fads like gay liberation, transgenderism, open borders immigration, things that the working class despises and would, if they had the choice, would censor or imprison or put in mental institutions gays and transgenders and end immigration. That's objectively when working class people vote. I mean, that's really what happens. But so Marxists in academia will come up with these, word salads and fudge the numbers to make it seem, no, see, gays are the real working class. Forget the fact that the gay districts, every single gay neighborhood in America is extremely expensive. Forget that. We have to retcon these things to justify this or reconcile it with Marxism.
Well, you can okay. So first of all, you can give me any study and I can say, well, I don't like it so that the numbers are fudged, but you haven't demonstrated how the numbers are fudged. I don't have any reason to believe that a peer-reviewed academic study, which the methodology of is completely transparent, is at all fudged if you can't provide me evidence that it is fudged. It seems more to me like you're hearing the study and you're saying, well, I don't like the results, so I'm going to say baselessly that it's probably incorrect because it disagrees with my inductive reasoning. And also you say that this is like a Marxist plot, but like this doesn't make any sense because a vast majority of academics are Marxist. According to a 2006 nationally representative survey of American professors, like at most in the specific area in which Marxists are most overrepresented, the percentage of Marxists is around 10%.
So could you give me the name of the person that did the study? Give me the names of the people that did the study about how gays are the real working class.
Okay, so
give me their names.
Okay, so it's a Williams Institute study at UCLA. Okay, hold on. I'll try to look up the names of the people doing the study.
While he's doing that, Striker, we're coming up on about 40 minutes. I don't know if you want to. I mean, an hour.
I'll go on a little longer. Let me push him on a couple other issues, and then we'll wrap it up.
Sounds good, because we do have some donations to get through as well. I just wanted to do a
little
time
I'll
check.
Get through them. Don't worry.
I know. I was just doing a time check. That's all.
Okay, no problem.
Okay. It seems that the name of the person doing this study is Gary Gates.
Gates.
Wait, is this correct? Wait, I think that's it. Or, yeah, that's the name I found identified to the link that I clicked on.
It's unfortunate because his name is very kind of
not Jewy.
No, it's kind of what is it? Generic.
Common, sure.
So it's very hard to look into this person. But anyway, I will personally look into this later.
Yeah,
and
sure.
So okay. So the thing is that the point I'm making is you can cite studies from UCLA and so on from, different think tanks and whatnot, but I could easily say, well, this doesn't add up to what I see. My logical deductions.
I think that like peer-reviewed, like methodologically transparent academic studies are like more sound and credible than your logical deductions, or at least like that's my general outlook.
You don't think that logical deductions are sometimes can for example the logical deduction of saying the more illegal immigrants at my job site, the lower my wages and bargaining potential. That would be a logical deduction.
But it's a logical.
But however, hold on. But the vast majority of research says that this logical deduction is wrong. right?
Actually, the vast majority of research doesn't say that. I mean, I was like a social democrat a while ago. I looked at a lot of studies, and I even, as a person who was trying to confirm a pro-immigration bias, I looked at the studies and I came to the conclusion that that on average, yeah, I have to reconcile the fact that uh, immigrants do lower wages, right?
Okay, so but there are many peer-reviewed studies that say otherwise.
Yeah, but like for example, the Cato
How do
Institute
you? Okay,
studies.
hold on one second. Sorry to interrupt you, but one other thing. One other thing. So there's a lot of peer-reviewed studies that say otherwise, and there's a few studies, and trust me, I've looked into this, and it's actually not that easy to find the studies that disprove that. You have to really dig to find them. The dominant studies are the ones, the peer-reviewed, the dominant academic consensus by and large is that immigration is good for the economy, it's good for workers. Now, there are dissenting studies that say no, that's not true. How do you decide which one's right or wrong other than logical deduction?
So yeah, of course you're going to need to use logical deduction to look through the methodology of each study, find out which one is more sound, which one has larger sample sizes, which one has more sound methodology, methodological techniques, etc. But that doesn't mean like you can't extrapolate that to the conclusion that me seeing based on like where I live that look, I think I see a lot of queers on TV, therefore on average the aggregate effect is
that's not what I said. I said
gay
that
people are richer. Right?
the zip codes, the wealthiest zip codes of America have a disproportionate number of homosexuals living in them. That's what I said. Now you could argue, well, that doesn't mean all of them are wealthy, which is fine, but you will admit that there is an overrepresentation of homosexuals in elite positions.
I mean, I'd have to see data on that. Again, I mean, the elite positions doesn't necessarily correlate with higher standards of wealth. However, so I will grant you that. But the data that I've seen, again, the Williams Institute study finds that gay people are on average poorer than straight people.
Okay. Well, I haven't. I will look into it. I have seen studies that show that homosexuals are after when all else is equal, homosexual households are far more affluent. They have more disposable income than normal households with families.
Sure.
That seems to be. I mean, if you're going to tell me a homosexual is more likely to live in a trailer than in an affluent and luxurious city center, homosexuals are more likely per capita to live in Paris or London or New York or San Francisco or LA than they are to living in, I don't know, even cities, poorer cities that have, for example, Queer as Folk was set in the city of Pittsburgh, but there's not a huge homosexual population there. So even places that on TV are very gay, those places, because they're poor, they're less affluent, they don't have as many homosexuals as the luxurious city centers, But anyway,
I mean,
that's something we're going to go back and forth on. I will look into that. Maybe my eyes and ears and logic is defying me. And, I'm not saying, again, that there's not some gays that are poor, but I think that if you adjust it for race, for, general geographical location and so on, you will find that homosexuals are far more likely to be affluent.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I don't think that most gays are black people, though. I don't think there's like a disproportionate amount of like gays who are black, because I assume the assumption you're going off of is that if they're more black, then they're more likely to be poor. But
right.
like sure, but yeah, I mean, you would
transgenders are actually until the bourgeoisie took it up as a fad. Transgenderism was disproportionately more likely to occur in colored communities than in white ones.
Yeah, well, sure. I'm not really sure the data on that. I'm not really sure, what relevance it holds. But yeah, I guess my general assumption is that I generally like to base my views off of, logic is fine and I can deduct a lot of things, but I generally like to base my assumptions off of, the large scale, like aggregate, studies, because there are so many factors I can't really account for in just deductive reasoning. And so I guess that's my.
So let me.
Is there anything else that you wanted to discuss?
Yeah. Let's move on from this. I want to get, because you seem a little hesitant to discuss immigration, but I'm actually quite surprised that you admit that immigration in the current form is a disaster for the working class. It's very interesting that you believe that. I mean, how do other left comms see that in respects to what you believe?
Well, I don't know if it's necessarily a disaster for the working class, as you'd say. I mean, I think for these things you have to weigh like cost benefit ratios and so on. But yes, I do think that there is significant evidence that immigration drives down wages. Does this mean that I think that we shouldn't let immigrants in? No, of course not. In fact, I actually I would encourage internationalism as much as possible, the bonding between races as much as possible, and anything that can do that, I would advocate for. So I don't really have a stake. Like I'm not like hesitant to give my position on it. I can give you what I can logically see from like empirical studies based on the research that I've done. I can tell you what I see from that, but I'm not going to make any normative statements based on what we should do within the framework of capitalist society. Because I just don't have any dog in that.
So yeah, well, that's tactical nihilism, because you did take a position now that you said, if anything, I would support immigration for internationalist reasons. The problem I have with that is, what do you think? I mean, did you ask the average working class person what they think? Did you ask them and say, hey, we're going to bring in all these immigrants in the name of international race mixing? But it's going to cost you the fact that you're gonna have your wages stagnating, and you're going to lose your benefits, and it's going to undermine some of the labor rights that come with a tighter labor market. I mean, did you make that case to the working class? Because the working class don't agree with you.
Sure. Well, no, but okay. So I'm going to be honest here. I didn't claim that I would definitively support immigration for internationalist reasons, right? My claim is that whatever furthers the international cause is what I would support. Now, I haven't done a lot of research on the impact of immigration on the tendency towards and the propensity for internationalism. I mean, that's a very complex thing, which I would have to look into. I mean, which I haven't, and I mean, you kind of put me on the spot here, so I don't really have a definitive answer for that. But generally, yeah, I don't base my views regarding like what would benefit the current material conditions within the confines of the capitalist framework.
All right. So basically, on the hot button question of immigration that the vast majority of leftists make the center of their activism, you have no position on that at all.
Sure. Yeah. So you can call it like tactical nihilism, right? I don't.
That's what it is.
Well, sure. I don't necessarily agree with that. I don't think that we should do nothing. I think that there's a point at which we can do things, but right now, given the specific material conditions as of the moment, there's really nothing we can do. I mean, we don't have workers' councils right now. We don't have a party right now. We have right now the revolution is sort of in retreat, because this is just the strength of the workers' movement is dependent on the material conditions of the time, and we don't live in a time where there are workers' councils in a party and are actually the revolution can be actualized. Now, maybe in a couple decades, if there's another massive economic collapse, which there very well may be very soon, a massive world war, then yeah, material conditions are such that we can establish workers' councils in a party and actually do something.
You're not taking a well. This is actually kind of. I'll tell you what I think, and perhaps I'm mischaracterizing you. What I think is that you saw some of the data. You saw some of the dissenting data, oftentimes from groups that are seen as reactionary or right-wing, or SPLC calls them hate groups. You saw some of the data, and you put that together with your day-to-day experiences, what you see, logical deduction, and you're coming on immigration to a politically incorrect conclusion, which is that immigration is bad for workers and wages. But because of the enormous social pressure and fear, you're afraid to publicly take the position that is true, which is that mass immigration lowers wages and hurts workers. You know it's true, but you won't take that position for the same reason academics that find out that homosexuals are more likely to molest children will refuse to take that position and publish that data. So, well, I mean, do you see why tactical nihilism is why people have a hard time discussing things with leftists? because oftentimes libertarian type of leftists or liberal radlibs, I'm not saying exactly that you're a radlib because you do seem to be a little more thoughtful. I'll give you that. But you know, in the name of internationalism, we have, when it comes to immigration, two things going on. One, you have the Canadian style system, which, you know, is making Canada a minority white country, which I know you don't care about that. But that system, it prioritizes people from the third world that are doctors and engineers. So what happens is that all of the doctors and engineers from India and Pakistan and places like Nigeria that have massive AIDS epidemics and massive suffering in need of social services and professionals that know how to be doctors. These places have brain drain to Canada, to America, and to Europe, and the people in those countries suffer. And at the same time, in the Western countries, the native engineers, they get pushed out by H-1Bs, and suddenly $100,000 engineer now goes for $50,000. So, you know, the point I'm making here is that if you're going to suggest, which you somewhat did before, that immigration is good for internationalism, well, actually, immigration means everyone in the world loses, except for the capitalists that saves money, except for Tim Cook, who the queer CEO Tim Cook, who for all of his virtue signalings about progressivism is profiting and undercutting his workers through this H-1B visa program that they pay both Republicans and Democrats to loosen. So, I mean, what would you think of all that?
So, for one, I think that the kind of the crux of your argument is that I can acknowledge that there are negative externalities of immigration, and I only refuse to go rail against immigration because I think it's like politically incorrect, or I think that I'll be criticized for it. I don't think that's necessarily true. For example, you know, there are many other issues which I have come to you know, have logical deductions about, which if I were to argue within the capitalist framework, I would say yes, this is good, or this is bad, but I don't take positions on them, not because I'm afraid of it, but because of you know, I just don't have a dog in a fight when it.
So why do you take positions on gay stuff and transgender things under the capitalist paradigm and capitalist system? You'll take positions on that.
I don't say that transgender people should. So like the, you know, the general slogan for people like me or Marxists who advocate for, you know, transgender rights and who take a position on like transgender science or gay science to find that, well, actually, contrary to common claims, gays aren't more likely to molest kids, or gays don't raise kids any worse, or transgender people aren't mentally ill, etc. We don't do this because we want reform within the capitalist framework, social reform. What our kind of slogan is, if you've probably heard it, is queer liberation, not rainbow capitalism. So we don't advocate for reform within the confines of capitalism.
Okay, so your thing is that because there are, you want to organize transgenders and gays in America in a Marxist way. You want to organize them
100%.
But what about illegal immigrants? I mean, when forced to choose, I mean, you admit that illegal immigrants hurt the working class. So would you be willing to organize the working class against immigration?
No, because so there are many things that hurt the working class within the confines of the capitalist system that I don't advocate against, because again, like I would be in favor of to be consistent with my position. I haven't given any inconsistencies. The logical conclusion, if I were to be logically consistent with what I just said about gay people, is that I would be most in favor of not taking a stance on reform within the capitalist system, but rather taking in immigrants and non-immigrants and uniting them in a way which sees that the whole reason that, you know, immigration may be a problem is because of the mechanisms of the capitalist system, and that we should therefore abolish that system, right? Like,
so let me propose something else. This is more intricate inside of Marxism.
Sure.
You know, one of the big things that led to revolutions historically was the fact that people were trapped in a broken system and had no choice but to overthrow their system, right? you see this all over the world. I mean, during the Cold War, you saw in Central America, which had the same problems they have now, people organized in socialist organizations to overthrow the Judeo-capitalists in places like Salvador or Nicaragua, places like that where people had nowhere to go because there was more strict immigration control. Don't you think that mass immigration, the fact that people that are being oppressed or that are suffering from material conditions and created by greed and capitalism and globalization in third world countries, but also, for other reasons, but this is, again, arguing from within the Marxist system. Don't you think that allowing immigration, if you yourself are someone that believes communism can only be achieved by a simultaneous international uprising, doesn't that hurt the international cause to allow all the poor and oppressed people of the world to go to wealthier white countries to live on social security benefits and to work these jobs that are shitty but help them subsist? Wouldn't it be better to keep them in their countries so that they could overthrow their governments? Wouldn't that push your agenda of simultaneously all these proletarians overthrowing the government at the same time? Wouldn't that be better?
Well, not necessarily, because I mean, if you have things like demographics mixing, like more Mexican people in America, more, American people in some other country, then you have countries which are more ethnically intertwined and ethnically similar to one another, which I think, it's your kind of people, like the fascists, the alt-righters, who say that we are able to cooperate better with people who are like us. So if every country is more demographically similar to one another on the macro scale, isn't it more likely that they'll be able to cooperate more effectively?
So you're admitting that race is real then?
What do you mean by race is real?
Well, if you believe hold on. Let me parse out what you're saying.
Sure.
So you're saying that if everyone that racial differences make it difficult for people in different countries to work together, and by importing non-whites to white countries and hoping that they'll race mix, you'll create there will be more racially mixed interactions, and thus the racial barriers will be broken down and international revolution will be easier. So
No.
you are accepting my premise that race is a barrier to cross organizing, and the only way to break that down is through forced race mixing. Because even when people live in diverse societies, they don't necessarily racially mix with each other. So how would you?
No, I'm not appealing to like biological differences. I'm not saying that well, because black people are genetically different from white people, it's harder for them to work together, so they should race mix more. No, I'm referring more to I'm referring more to cultural type things. So for example, if there's if everybody in America has this one specific heritage, this one specific culture, and they're isolated from other sorts of peoples, and all countries have this, then they're more divided, they're more isolated, right? This is the idea of nationalism, is forming a concrete national identity which isn't in tune with the rest of the world. My point is that this is a bad idea, because if it's not driven by genetic race differences, but rather the fact that if you have a culture that is built around its concrete identity and being separate from the rest of the world, it will be less likely that this nation can effectively cooperate with the rest of the world.
Okay, so in other words, you support breaking down cultures around the world into this kind of stew or a mishmash, and that is going to lead to the international communist revolution, because you see that to an extent, and where you do see that, you see that capitalists tend to be stronger in very racially diverse areas like New York or California.
I mean, what's the cause-effect relationship of that? I mean, do you even have any data that this is viable?
Well, what do you mean data that's viable? I mean, are California and New York not the most racially diverse states in America?
Sure. What is? I mean, what is that like?
And
Like
and
I don't.
those are the places that have the most wealth and equality in America as well.
Yeah, but of course, correlation doesn't equal causation. I mean, for example,
Well, what about
if
Paris?
a
What about
certain
Paris or
if a certain
Berlin
state
or
or a nation
London?
is more rich, of course, more immigrants are going to want to go there. But that doesn't mean that having a more diverse population necessarily has a cause-effect relationship
But
with the
the
capitalist
wealth, no, hold on.
stronger, right? I think it can be an
Wealth,
example of
no,
backwards
no.
causation.
The wealth inequality in California and New York has gotten far worse since they became multicultural. Finding a middle class person, a person that works a job that makes that can live a middle class lifestyle is very rare in California nowadays, or New York, or Paris, or London, or Berlin. Berlin is a little different because it's still in a transitionary phase. But you look at the other ones, you see it very clearly. Those places at one point, I mean, you look at the houses. Go to Brooklyn. Go to New York City. You look at the houses. Those were made for families, and instead of families living in there, you have people renting rooms. You have three Mexicans in one room. You have a bug man working in the tech industry in another room. Like, this is not creating a more revolutionary consciousness. It's doing the opposite. It kills the revolutionary consciousness. How can you
Well,
have
so you're
revolutionary
saying that
consciousness? Yeah.
diversity increases income inequality. Income
Yes.
inequality is inevitably a negative externality of capitalism. You said earlier that worse material conditions leads to there being more likely a revolution. So doesn't that kind of contradict what you said earlier? If worse material conditions makes
Ah.
revolution more likely and diversity leads to worse material conditions, doesn't that mean that diversity actually does increase the likelihood of revolution?
Well, that's
And I
the
mean,
interesting thing about diversity is if you have three houses, one has a Polish immigrant, the other one has a Korean immigrant, and then the third one has a Chinese immigrant. I mean, a Chinese immigrant, and the fourth has a Guatemalan immigrant. Those people don't even speak the same language, much less have the ability to understand one another and actually coordinate a revolution. I mean, there's very hard historical precedents that show that the countries that had the revolutions were the ones that had the fewest ethnic tensions. So you see things like, places like China, very homogenous. That's where you see. But again, the problem I have is that I can't refer to history or historical precedents because you don't accept any communist experience ever. But the point I'm making is that if diversity had any revolutionary potential, why is it that the masses grow weaker, but also do not have? I mean, the reason that capitalists allowed for labor unions in the 1940s, 50s, and before that in the 20s and 30s, and even in the late 19th century, capitalists were forced to give concessions because the workers were united and ready to overthrow them. So the fact
yeah,
that
and like
capitalists feel no need to grant people concessions anymore tells you a lot about the effect of diversity on the working class.
wait, so you say that the capitalists don't you're basing this argument on the premise that capitalists no longer feel the necessity to grant uh, concessions to the workers. At least that's what I got from your argument.
Yes.
But the problem is, one, the material conditions are far different. For example, last time when concessions were granted, they were granted because there was like a world war going on. There was like a massive depression going on, and so material conditions were so bad that there was a legitimate threat of a worker uprising, and they had to grant concessions to ward this off. Right now that isn't happening. And also, I mean, you say that like they don't feel the need to grant concessions, but I mean, like, doesn't the like popularity of people like Bernie Sanders like drive us to the opposite conclusion? Like, I mean, if you look at
Oh,
the
that's
political
very
climate
interesting.
in the
Actually, hold
US,
on. Let
that seems
me
to be
address
our
that. Let
driving
me
force to,
let
like,
let me let me address the Bernie Sanders thing. In 2016, I can't opine on Bernie Sanders now because he actually has changed and he's become less popular because of it. Now he pays lip service to illegal immigration. Like the other day at the debate, Bernie Sanders was talking about Medicare for all, a popular idea. It's been polled. You will admit Medicare for all is very popular, right?
mm-hmm.
So it's a very popular idea. It crosses left and right. But then Bernie Sanders says, oh, yeah, but then we need Medicare for all for every illegal alien. And suddenly people stop taking him seriously. So,
Well, do you have evidence that his polling numbers are going down? Because I don't really
oh
see that.
yeah, Bernie Sanders is outspending most of the other Democrats, and his polls are very lackluster. So this is compared to 2016, where he ran an organic populist movement. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. In 2016, Bernie Sanders defeated Hillary Clinton in the most white working class states. He defeated her in many Rust Belt states, in places like West Virginia, that are entirely white. Meanwhile, Hillary Clinton, the open Wall Street neoliberal, did very well in New York and California, the most diverse states. Hillary Clinton got more votes from people of color than Bernie did. So that's a good example of how diversity is used to quell working people. The reason they run Bernie is as a kind of, from the economic point of view, it's kind of a distraction for white working people in the Midwest that are suffering from outsourcing and globalization and so on. So Bernie was largely popular with whites disproportionately in very white areas. Meanwhile, Hillary was very popular in very diverse areas. Doesn't that prove what I'm saying?
No, I don't think so, because you say that, like, well, look at these nations or these places which are more diverse, and they voted for Hillary Clinton more. Well, I think that the rich people had a vested interest in keeping in Hillary Clinton winning. Obviously,
Sure.
Hillary Clinton would do the bidding of the rich more so than Bernie Sanders,
Yeah.
and I think there's a correlation between more wealth and more diversity.
So rich people, rich Jews, and so in some cases gays, supported the neoliberal candidate Hillary. But
Rich
they can't. Yeah, they can't. But they can't. But how do you explain why blacks overwhelmingly voted for Hillary over Bernie or Mexicans in California? Those people aren't that rich. They're not rich at all. Why did they vote for Hillary? I mean, Hillary did outspend Bernie by a lot.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think it has a lot to do with the fact that, I mean, for example, Hillary, if you look at the way that they spent their money, Hillary spent a lot more money into advertising and targeting specifically black people in these minorities than did Bernie, whereas Bernie spent most of his time campaigning in like Rust Belt areas.
No, Hillary outspent Bernie everywhere.
Yeah, sure.
And
but that doesn't
somehow
mean,
that worked with non-white in non-white areas, but it didn't work with white working people.
Well, the fact that she outspent him across the board does not mean that the fact that she outspent him across the board does not mean that she didn't outspend him more so in more colored areas, which I believe that she did.
Okay, so you're just not going to engage at all with the fact that the most diverse places in America all went for Hillary, and the least diverse all went for Bernie.
Most places are the most wealthy, and wealthy people have a vested interest in propagandizing for Hillary within these places, and
they propagandize for people in everywhere.
What?
The wealthy, most power in America is concentrated in New York and California.
Yeah, but
that power is projected through mass media. Is projected to the rest of the country. That's why CNN, and MSNBC were all for Hillary. And people in West Virginia get MSNBC and CNN, just like black people in California do, or Mexicans in California. They all get the same channels. So I don't understand the reason.
There's things which are like geographically specific, such as like billboards and localized advertisements. Like, I think you keep making this conflation that because something happens, you keep making the assumption that just because something happens in everywhere, that means it doesn't happen disproportionately in certain areas, which is just a logical fallacy. Like,
okay, well, I just think that you're not going to twist your arm on this because you don't like the ramifications of it. It's a fact that more diverse areas always vote with the status quo.
Which I don't deny that fact. I just think you're drawing a false causation. I mean, it's like one of the main logical fallacies is falsely drawing a causation just from an observed correlation.
Well, you're just being pedantic.
We can look into.
pedantic.
No, because we can look into other factors which could obviously mediate this observed correlation in a way which doesn't suggest the causation that you're looking at. I listed
Okay.
several of them, for example.
Yeah, okay.
Diversity
So
makes people
I
more
mean, the problem with being pedantic is like you can deconstruct, the sky being blue like that. Like it's the fact of the matter is that non-white people vote with the status quo, and that's because they're first of all the people, the neoliberals appeal to them on identity basis. I mean, what do you think? Last thing before we go, what do you think of identity politics in general? I mean, you do see how neoliberals utilize that against whites.
I think identity politics is in general a bad thing because I think that we should look more to class rather than things like race.
That's very controversial amongst left comms, They would call you a class reductionist and a Strasserite.
I mean, I've discussed this with several left comms. I mean, I wouldn't say that they would call me a Strasserite. I mean, Strasserites kind of do the opposite, right? Like, isn't like the negation.
Well, they don't know what it means. I mean, these people that do that don't know what it actually means. Like,
sure.
They just throw it out there because they want to smear people that disagree with their liberal pearl clutching.
I mean, of course that's going to happen, right? Like, I mean, I don't disagree with that.
Yeah. Okay. So you're against identity politics. All right.
Yeah, in general, I think that it's better to observe differences and issues based on class rather than things like race.
Okay. Again, you actually seem kind of reasonable on some of these things. I don't want to ask you personal questions or try to characterize you, but are you really just for the tranny and gay shit because you're gay or something? I'm not saying it to discredit or attack you. I'm just asking because you seem like on everything but that you're very reasonable. You're very
I just take the perspective of my goal is to be honest about issues and go off of what I observe scientifically and empirically. Obviously I've done a lot of research on all of these issues, from immigration to the LGBT community. The reason that some of my conclusions are not consistent, or some of my conclusions on one issue kind of contradict what you would expect based on my conclusions from other issues, is because I don't base my conclusions on some thing that I want to believe, right?
Okay.
I just base it on what I do evidence, and the evidence that I've seen and the research that I've done suggests that the correct approach to LGBT issues is that many of these things, like the claim that gay people are mentally ill, the claim that trans people are mentally ill, the claim that gay people are more likely to be pedophiles, these things just don't hold up empirically, and so I argue against them.
I think you might be quite young. I didn't want to go too crazy with you because I can tell you're kind of young. And personally, I think that being young and already having some common sense views on at the very least, you're on the correct frequency when it comes to some of this stuff, except for the gay and tranny stuff. I think that at some point when you get older, you're going to change your views on some of these things. And if you're not bound by some perversion or something, you might one day be one of us. I know you don't like that, but trust me, when I was a younger teenager, I was never for the gay or transgender stuff, but I was a Marxist, and then I started to do logical deduction in my day-to-day life, but also start to read some alternative books. Some books that might challenge some of my preconceived notions on the world. Hopefully you might look into that and maybe become a little more enlightened on on why some of this stuff is happening. Things like globalism and open borders. Some of the stuff, these are products of capitalism. They're products of liberalism, and ultimately products of a disproportionate Jewish attack on Western civilization. And things like the family, things like traditional masculinity, things like racial identity and nationalism. These are the historic counters to capitalism, the real ones. I mean, what would you
Well,
think?
yeah, I mean, I don't really buy. I don't really buy a lot of these premises. I don't buy the premise that, I don't buy the whole Jewish question shenanigans. For example, that might be our most
Hmm.
prominent, one of our most prominent disagreements. I don't buy adherence to the family, as I see the family as sort of a result
Well,
of.
let's go one by one on this then. Hold on.
Oh, sure, sure.
Let's do the Jew thing.
Okay.
So you don't think it's relevant that 2% of the American population is 40% of the billionaires? You don't think that has any impact on how our society is governed?
Well, I think we have to look at, not just the facts, the bare fact, but we have to look at, the reasons why these disparities exist. And
Okay.
so for me,
But you're not denying the disparity, though.
no, of course I'm not
Okay.
denying the disparity. My position is that I think that while there are disparities in wealth between, for example, like Jews and Gentiles, I think that these disparities are for a variety of reasons. I think that this is because Jews have, on average, higher IQs. I think that
Oh,
is
whoa. So you're a race realist.
no, the
Oh,
race realist position
tactical
is
race realism.
well,
No.
the race realist
So
position is
IQ
that
is
there are.
hereditary.
Yeah, the race realist position is that there are differences in IQ between like races, and that this is
Oh.
genetic. I don't necessarily I subscribe to the view that it's genetic, and in fact, I think that the whether or not race and IQ is genetic is something that is inconclusive. I don't see that there has been a conclusive answer to that
Oh,
question. So I would.
tactical nihilism again.
Well, no, I've just done the research. Like for example,
But if it's inconclusive, well, hold on then. So then where do Jews get their supposed high IQs then? Where do they get it? You don't think
well,
there's
for
a genetic
example.
reason for that?
Not necessarily. I think that there's a variety of environmental factors. For example, we can look at where the places where Jews have historically immigrated. For example, since the Enlightenment, and particularly in the 20th century, European Jews have been highly concentrated in major urban centers. For example, Warsaw, Berlin, Frankfurt, Vienna, Paris, New York City, Los Angeles, etc. These areas tended to have the infrastructure to support intellectual achievement, and so
Well,
like
that's
I
not what
think
they
that.
say. They claim they were locked out of these institutions and discriminated against.
Well,
Uh,
that's like a different time frame, right? Like I think that the claim that these people were barred from manual labor and forced into money lending, this claim
oh
is made
no,
in
no, no,
regards
no,
to
no.
like
I have to cut you off there. I have to cut you off there. So you're telling me that the Jews were that somehow the evil Gentiles prevented Jews from farming, and that's why they became speculators and finance capitalists? Come on, man. Do you really believe that? I mean,
well,
would you rather be a beet farmer or a billionaire that's making money off sitting around speculating on things? I mean that is not something they're. In fact,
it's not like billionaires that make money lending, right?
Sven Longshanks in the United Kingdom, the king, he gave the Jews a last chance. He said the Jews are a problem in my country, in the United Kingdom. So he created a program where the Jews were given property and they were given guild training. They were not just not locked out of these institutions. They were actively pushed into them. Guilds and so on, honest labor. And after this experiment was over, the Jews simply refused to work. They wanted to lend money
So
because it's easy.
sure. So
Lending
that
money is easy. It's little work with high profit, is it not?
no, sure. I mean, it depends on like the time frame, right? Well, first of all, I didn't make the argument that
Objectively, let's take all morals out of it.
sure.
From a purely objective perspective, what would you rather do? Would you rather be farming turnips, or would you rather be speculating at Goldman Sachs
It
or whatever the
depends.
equivalent?
It depends on the broader implications of these jobs, given the specific time period and the specific civilization. Also, I never really made the argument that Jews were forced into manual labor. I mean, I have seen one analysis which finds that this was kind of common, but I haven't read through the whole analysis, so I'm not
Okay.
going to say that it's definitively true or untrue. But the thing that I'm citing is
Okay.
Cochrane, Hardy, and Harpending in 2006. I
That's
haven't read
fine.
through the
Yeah.
whole thing. There
Okay.
might be issues with it. I don't know. My point wasn't that this happened. My point was that Shit, what was my point that I brought that up for? I think I was pointing out that I think I was pointing out that like fuck, I can't remember what my point was. But no, I wasn't bringing that up to say that this happened and this is why they're overly successful. I was bringing this up as
Let's say that Jews. Your original point is that Jews are overrepresented in
yeah.
PowerPoint in the West because of their high IQ. Let's pretend for a second that this is true.
They're
Isn't
high.
that true? Couldn't that be true for all capitalists? Does that make it okay? Does that make the capitalist system the system of exploiting labor? Does that make it okay? Just because, I mean, you will admit that largely, not always, but in many cases, people that are corporate, hedge fund runners and people that are corporate moguls, they tend to be, quote, higher IQ. We could possibly make that argument. Does that make it okay or justified or rationalized as a Marxist?
No, I don't think that someone having a high IQ and being successful makes the exploitation of other people, which they utilize once they reach that success, justified. And I would never say that. My position was just that I don't think that a conspiracy is necessary to explain overrepresentation, because we have things like how Jews have historically immigrated. We have things like Jewish IQ, all of which can explain.
Well, it depends. Hold on a second. This is the problem I have with leftists, is that they'll meet you halfway, but then say, no, that's a conspiracy theory. You have to define what a conspiracy theory is and why simply outlining a conspiracy is somehow it de facto disproves an assertion. For example,
well, I don't know.
Is it a conspiracy that when Italian immigrants came to America, they largely donated their extra money to the church, Catholic Church? When German immigrants came, they largely donated to German cultural centers. But when Jewish immigrants first came to America, they pulled their money together through the Kahilla. There's something called the Kahilla. And they bought things like the New York Times. They bought things like, they put money aside to influence the government as an ethnic community. You wouldn't say that Irishmen that put their money aside to push Irish culture in America, that this is a conspiracy. So why is it a conspiracy when the ethnic Jew gets together with other ethnic Jews, puts their money together, and plans to buy the New York Times so they can influence culture better? I mean, why is that a conspiracy?
Okay, so a couple things. So for one, I don't know which specific rendition of the Jewish question you identify with. I mean, is it like for future reference, is it like the Kevin McDonald culture?
Not necessarily. I agree with much of McDonald's research. I don't agree with all of his conclusions, but that's very in depth, and that I would recommend you read it. But my view is that I really don't give a fuck why Jews are in charge. It's that they shouldn't be in charge. That's my view on that.
Sure. So for one, I think if we look at the reasons, okay, so my problem with the Jewish question is people like Kevin McDonald, and even people who don't necessarily subscribe to his particular rendition, they operate off of a couple assertions. Well, for one, they think that Jews are overly ethnocentric, right? And I don't see really any evidence for this. I mean, so for example, Jews American Jews, the American secular Jews who advocate for many of the left-wing policies, which fascists point to and say, "Oh, look, that means it's they're doing this to."
Don't put me in a box. I've never said that Jews are left or right wing.
Oh, okay. Well, do you think that
they're Jew wing? Because in the United Kingdom, Jews vote for the Tory party, which is a right liberal conservative party. And in America, they vote for the Democrats. But ultimately, what Jews left and right universally, almost universally, not all, what they have in common is that they're both advocates of liberalism. So they support right-wing liberalism as much as they do left-wing liberalism. That's why in the United States, you get the kosher sandwich, where when the Republicans take power, they run on anti-immigration, as you will admit Trump did. He ran on a total crackdown on immigration, implying that he was going to even deport millions of people. And he didn't do any of it. Instead, what he did was he gave a tax cut for billionaires who were disproportionately Jewish. And then when the Democrat gets in charge, He runs on stamping out corruption in the medical industry. He runs on supporting labor rights. But then when they get to power, the only thing they do is support mass immigration and not anything on Medicare.
Well, I mean,
look at,
Trump
for
did do a
example,
lot of
yes,
stuff on immigration, for
no, he
example.
didn't. He hasn't done anything. There's more
Well,
immigration
he-
happening now than there was under Obama.
I mean, he did some things, for example, incentivizing sanctuary cities to give away the immigrants that they held, and he's fought very hard to build it, that wall. He did a whole government shutdown over it, etc.
And it's not happening. He's not going to do it.
Okay.
He's not going to do it.
Well, I mean, it's undeniable they tried very hard to do it. But
Well,
my argument,
why is it that Donald Trump quote tries very hard? He's talking about ICE raids and he deports 35 people. But then when it comes to stuff about Israel, Donald Trump will veto Congress. He'll go against Congress so that they can keep trafficking arms to Saudi Arabia, like his top advisor Jared Kushner says is good for Israel.
well, I can't really give an analysis of why Trump supports Israel. His reasons are his own. But
what about Occam's
you're going to
razor?
talk
What about Occam's razor? What about like if Trump was a fanatical supporter of Ireland and was supporting the Irish in taking back Northern Ireland, would you not say that there might be some perhaps pressure from the Irish community, some money, some influence, some Irishmen in the media promoting that? Like you wouldn't think there's any correlation there?
So, okay, I don't really care what Trump is doing.
That's tactical nihilism.
No, my point is that so your argument is like, the Jews, they're trying to support Israel because they're voting to further their own interests. That's like the whole crux of
they're not voting. No, they're not voting because the Jewish vote is largely irrelevant. They are the top. They are beyond reasonable doubt. They're the top donors to the Democrats and Republicans. The top donors for the Republicans are Sheldon Adelson, are Paul Singer, are various other Jews. And for the Democrats, it's Chaim Saban, George Soros, Tom Steyer. These are the top donors to both parties. And by far, they give tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars to the Republicans and Democrats. Yeah. And people like both Chaim Saban for the Democrats and Sheldon Adelson for the Republicans are both on record saying that they are one-issue donors. Israel. Okay. They are for advancing the interests of the Jewish community, which is why they give hundreds of millions of dollars. That, my friend, is not a conspiracy theory.
Okay, but if you look at it from a more broad perspective, Jews at large, or at least the majority of liberal secular Jews in the U.S., largely supported massive waves of Somali immigration into Israel. Jews in the U.S. also. Israel. Yeah, and large amounts of immigration into Israel. Liberal secular Jews in survey overwhelmingly supported that.
And how did that go?
I mean, it doesn't really matter. My point is that Jews in the U.S. in large part supported something which, by your criteria, is contradictory to their interests. So clearly, this theory that they're influencing
that is totally hold up. What you just stated, I would love to see a citation for that because that's
okay. Yeah, I can absolutely give you a citation. I can send this to you, and you can look over it a little bit later.
Israel, which is the Jewish ethno-state, has a zero tolerance view on immigration. You would think that if Jews were really so liberal and so humanistic.
No, but we're talking about Israeli Jews. We're talking about the U.S. Jews, and they, according to Lukot and Smets in 1999, liberal U.S. Jews overwhelmingly supported Ethiopian immigration into Israel. And also, I'd like to point out that Jews in the U.S.
is different. First of all, Ethiopians are 1% of the Israeli population. And the Israeli government itself, the Israeli rabbinate, declared Ethiopians, not Somalis, but Ethiopians, as honorary Jews. They did some trick, basically. And today, the way it worked is the Israeli government, not secular Jews, Israeli government, they accepted the Ethiopian Jews. When they got there, they were sterilized. They had depot shots taken to control their birth rates. Ethiopian Jews in Israel are used largely for manual labor and as frontline infantry soldiers in the IDF. And so the reason they brought them over was so that they could do dirty work as slaves. That would be like saying, the people that brought slaves to the United States They did it because they love integration and tolerance, rather than the fact that they just wanted to use blacks as
No, but you keep
Wait.
conflating that, like the Jews in Israel who are trying to use the Ethiopians for this specific purpose to the average secular U.S. Jews who are the ones pulled in this data, right? I think that you can't really conflate the intentions of these two groups in supporting this specific thing, because these are two massively different groups, and I don't.
Can you name, if they're two massively different groups, can you name me one Zionist organization in America, one Jewish community organization in America that is anti-Israel?
I mean, I can't really name you any Jewish
organization. I can name you dozens. I can name you the American Jewish Committee. I can name you the World Jewish Congress. I can name you the Anti-Defamation League, the Southern Poverty Law Center.
Sure you can, but that doesn't mean that the average U.S. secular Jew doesn't differ politically heavily from the average Israeli Jew, which was my initial point.
Why is it that they don't have any?
They do. Of course, like for example, U.S. secular Jews overwhelmingly oppose Trump, whereas Israeli Jews
hold on. How come
these are two different demographics?
How come? If this was true, if there was some consensus that liberal Jews are, totally different from Israeli Jews, why is it that all these liberal Jewish organizations like the Anti-Defamation League, will you admit that the ADL is a liberal organization? They're for gay stuff, they're for tranny stuff, they're for they talk about white privilege, they're for open borders, they're for unlimited refugees. You'll admit that the ADL is a liberal group, right?
Sure.
Liberal Jew. So then why is it that the liberal Jewish community's mouthpiece, the ADL, the representatives, why are they fanatical Zionists to the point where when the children were shot on the Israeli border last year, when they were protesting unarmed, Palestinian children and women were protesting on the border of Israel, the IDF opened fire on them with live ammunition, killed dozens of them.
Well, if you want to trade individual examples.
Let me finish.
Sure. Okay.
The ADL put out a statement justifying this. So can you show me a Jewish organization that does not embody the quite odd, I've asked many leftists to show me a Jewish organization that doesn't embody the very bizarre combination of extreme cultural liberalism for white countries and extreme supremacy for Israel. Show me one. There's dozens of Jewish organizations, and you can't show me one that reflects these so-called polls that you claim you saw somewhere. You can't show me one that represents, if the secular Jewish liberal community of America was really what those, quote, polls claim, they would certainly have at least one organization that is very anti-Zionist.
Okay, well, I can't name any Zionist organizations, and I can't name any anti-Zionist organizations. But who's the foremost?
ADL, right? You said you're familiar with the ADL.
I'm not familiar with their stances on Zionism, but who's Israel's foremost critic right now? The foremost public critic of Israel is arguably Noam Chomsky, who is a Jew.
No, it's not. Right now, it's not. Noam Chomsky, by the way, was supporting the Syrian rebels recently. He was supporting America staying in the occupation in Syria to protect the Kurds, which also, by the way, if you look into Israeli geopolitics, excuse me?
Well, but what does that have to do with ethnocentricity? How does that further Jewish interests?
Well, the Israeli government actually sees the Kurds as a kind of a geopolitical force against Iran and against.
But if he was supporting them because of his support for Israel, why does he explicitly oppose Israel?
He doesn't explicitly support Israel.
What
Noam Chomsky does is co-opt critiques of Zionism and war. For example, Noam Chomsky was the one who invented the blood for oil myth, right? He invented the idea of blood for oil in Iraq. Meanwhile, there was never any oil corporation lobby that was pushing for the Iraq war. The Iraq war was entirely planned by literally a couple of dozen of Jews, of neoconservative Zionists and people at think tanks that are also neoconservative Zionist Jews. So Noam Chomsky did a kind of misdirection where he said, no, it's not about Israel or Zionism. The war in Iraq is actually about oil. Meanwhile, here we are more than a decade after the war, 15 years after the war, not a drop of oil, and yet we're trillions of dollars into the war.
My problem with what you're saying right now is that you're assuming that an academic, a person's motivation in taking a position that they hold is because of their allegiance to a state which they explicitly, ruthlessly critique. I mean, I've seen a 2-hour Noam Chomsky lecture going over the crimes of Israel and how he believes it's like an illegitimate state and so on. So, like,
Right.
I don't think that it's
That's
valid
fine.
to say that Noam Chomsky holds the positions that he holds because of his allegiance to a state which he spends so much time critiquing and directly railing against.
I'm not saying even that it's something he does willingly. I'm saying that there is, the reason even on the left, when you talk to Jewish communists, the reason they get uneasy about Gentiles talking about attacking finance capital is that most or disproportionate number of finance capitalists are Jewish. So they get really defensive about that. I've seen that myself in different communist groups. So Noam Chomsky may himself not be an open and out Zionist. There is a spectrum, right, of that. But he is the opposition to Zionism. And it's a very weak one because the Zionists, with Noam Chomsky and other Jews at the helm of the anti-Zionist movement, the anti-Zionist movement has only gotten stronger. So, I mean, it's only gotten weaker. Okay. Israel is stronger today in terms of influence in many elite institutions than it was even 30 years ago. Now, that's for a million different reasons, but one of it is that it's taboo for leftists to say that the Iraq war was for Israel. And it's taboo because Chomsky says it's taboo.
I don't know about that. I don't think that people think it's taboo to say that the war was this sort of conspiracy for Jewish interests because of Noam Chomsky. I think that the stigma around Jewish conspiracy theories, I mean, even if you think that's an improper way to say it, has been around a lot longer than Noam Chomsky has been talking about what do you think caused the Iraq war.
Okay, so you know what? Even if I were to grant you, for the sake of argument, we got to get going soon, that Chomsky is a critic of Israel. It's kind of ridiculous that one exception disproves every single Jewish institution and representative body of the Jewish community. I mean, it's kind of preposterous. It's unscientific because aren't you the one that says anecdotes don't disprove data? Well,
no,
data
but I was responding to an individual example that you gave about a specific Jewish organization, and I said,
it's not an individual example. You just pretend you don't know what the World Jewish Congress is. I'm telling you that every Jewish organization represents this dynamic, and you say, but Noam Chomsky. I could say, there are genuine Jewish anti-Zionists like Finkelstein, like Gilad Atzmon, who's a very strong anti-Zionist. They're probably genuine. Max Blumenthal, those guys are genuine, but they're three guys compared to what? The ADL, compared to the SPLC, compared to the World Jewish Congress, the American Jewish Committee, compared to the B'nai B'rith, compared to the Wiesenthal Center. I mean, every single organization that represents the Jewish community has the same views. One exception to the rule doesn't disprove the rule. I mean, you would tell me that, right? So I think there's just cognitive dissonance there with you. With this stuff.
I mean, yeah, no. I wouldn't. So I'm not going to say that I don't really want to speak to like Jewish organizations like specifically, right? So but if you look at the Jewish population as a whole, if you can say that these are exceptions and not necessarily the general rule, and no, I would agree that we should look at the general rule. Right. Okay. And I think if you look at the general rule, Jews in the U.S., and I can't speak to organizations. I can't really name any of these organizations. I will admit my own education on this topic, but the research that I've done is more on like the individual Jewish people. And Jews in the U.S. have one of the highest intermarriage rates of any ethnicity. They, support immigration into Israel for reasons which we have no reason to believe were at all ethnocentric. There's no indication that they're at all, ethnocentric. They support policies which go against their interests. Jews are
not ethnocentric.
Has been dropping.
Jews are not just because Jared Kushner, the hyper Orthodox Jew, will marry a billionaire's daughter, who's a goy, doesn't mean Jews are not ethnocentric. They're simply adapting to their surroundings in a way where they have the power. Okay.
Well, even Kevin McDonald himself said that intermarriage rates are one of the best ways that we can gauge ethnocentricity, and it's not just an example of like one person, like a Jew marrying a non-Jew. It's an aggregate impact of Jews having disproportionately high intermarriage rates, which even anti-Jew academics admit is a good way to gauge ethnocentricity, right? Like, and it's not only
how do you gauge? Hold on. How do you gauge the disproportionate for example, like, Irish people, like different ethnic Catholics intermarry too. They're at far higher rates than Jews and Gentiles do. That doesn't mean that, that people who are ethnic Catholics can't be like white racists or something, right? Like, you would agree with that.
What do you mean? Wait, I'm sorry. Can you reiterate?
So if you're a white Catholic and you have different ethnic lineages, does that mean somehow that you can't be ethnocentric as well?
No, but in general, if a certain demographic has extremely high intermarriage rates, I mean, like one of the things that fascists and alt-righters say about like white genocide is like, well, white population has been falling. There's less and less white people. Yeah, but the same can be said for Jewish people. The Jewish population has been falling. Jews are marrying into other races and race mixing at extremely high rates. So, like, I don't see this ethnocentricity, which these people speak of.
The Jewish population globally is rising. Okay, that's a myth that the Jewish population is declining.
No, I'm talking about like the liberal secular Jews in the U.S.
Jews as a whole, the population is rising. While the population of every white, with very few exceptions, every white country, the white population is declining.
Sure. So if we're what we're acknowledging is contradictory trends in different Jewish groups, which doesn't this kind of contradict your notion of like this all-encompassing ethnocentricity?
What I find to be bizarre is that you seem to think that if one Jew marries into an elite Gentile family, that this is somehow a sign of lack of ethnocentrism rather than a kind of strategy to intermarry into the elites. Like, it would be like, in the times of kings and queens, like if a Jew were to intermarry with a queen or some kind of Gentile aristocrat, that this is a sign of ethnocentrism rather than trying to rise in the ranks of the society through intermarriage.
Sure. So a couple things. So for one, these people that they're intermarrying with are not like kings or queens, right? Like these
Chelsea
are
Chelsea Clinton and Donald Trump's daughter are the equivalent of kings or queens today.
But that's an individual example, right? This doesn't speak to like the broader trends. Saying that I can point to an example of a Jew marrying into somebody who's in a high status doesn't mean that all the Jews who are disproportionately intermarrying are doing so because they're intermarrying.
Let me. Well,
right? Like, and you also said that, I point. Okay, go ahead.
No, because Jared Kushner is affiliated to an extremely racialist form of Judaism. Look them up. Look up Jared Kushner's strand of Judaism.
No, because I'm talking about aggregate impacts, right? Like, I mean, you yourself earlier pointed to the fact that we can't look at specific examples to be indicative of broader social trends. I mean, you pointing to, look, this one Jew married somebody who's rich doesn't mean that all Jews who are disproportionately intermarrying are doing so, as this sort of strategy. You also brought up Occam's razor earlier, which is curious to me because it seems like if we go by Occam's razor, it seems more likely it takes more assumptions to assume that Jews are intermarrying to advance their ethnocentricity or their interests or whatever. That takes more.
So you don't think it's
by Occam's razor?
You don't think Occam's razor that Jews intermarrying into elite Gentile families, the Occam's razor is that Jews are trying to influence the elites, the white elites.
By Occam's razor, the theory that they're intermarrying to advance some interest takes a more assumption, is therefore more likely or more unlikely by the criteria of Occam's razor than the theory that they're just intermarrying because they're intermarrying and that this is a sign of them not being as ethnocentric.
Okay. All right. So we're just going to go back and forth here.
I do have to go, though.
Yeah. Okay. Let's just hit a few questions and then we can go.
Okay, sure.